In June 2021, Southern District of California Judge Roger Benitez made headlines when he struck down the state's 30-year-old ban on assault weapons, concluding that, like the Swiss Army knife, the popular AR-15 rifle is a perfect combination of home defense weapon and homeland defense equipment. Benitez's landmark decision was but one episode in the long-running political debate over gun rights and gun control in the United States, much of which is centered on the class of firearms known as assault rifles, and in particular, the popular AR-15 family. To gun control advocates, rifles like the AR-15 are deadly weapons of war, unsuited to civilian use, and the favored tools of criminals and mass shooters. While to gun rights activists, they're merely highly adaptable, reliable tools, no different from any other sporting firearm. But what is the truth of the matter? What's an assault rifle? How did it get its name? And how does this class of firearm differ from all others? The answer might surprise you. What we now call assault rifles can trace their origins back to the Second World War. While that conflict is remembered for introducing advanced technologies like radar, jet aircraft, and nuclear weapons, the average infantryman went into World War II armed essentially with the same weapon that his parents had used in the last war, a bolt-action, manually repeating rifle firing a full-power cartridge. The only major exception was the United States, which in 1936 became the first nation to use a semi-automatic rifle, the M1 Garand, as its standard infantry weapon. But while such weapons were well suited to shooting across no man's land during the Great War or the South African veldt during the Boer War, in the increasingly urban close-quarters combat troops were increasingly finding themselves engaged in, bolt-action rifles quickly became something of a liability. Not only were they slow and awkward to operate, severely limiting the volume of fire that could be laid down, but the full-power cartridges they fired, great for precision shots over long distances, were grossly overpowered, with army reports indicating that few combat engagements occurred at ranges over 300 meters. Such cartridges also made fully automatic weapons all but uncontrollable when fired from the shoulder. Thankfully, most armies had another class of weapon in their arsenal, the submachine gun. Developed at the end of the Great War for raiding and clearing trenches, submachine guns fired lower recoil, pistol-caliber ammunition and could deliver a murderous volume of fire at close quarters, making them ideal for urban combat. The advantage was exploited to great effect by the Soviet Red Army, who equipped entire infantry companies with PPSH-41 and 43 submachine guns for house-to-house fighting in cities like Stalingrad. But submachine guns were not a perfect solution, being inaccurate at ranges beyond a few dozen meters. Both the Soviets and the Germans quickly realized that this new kind of combat required a new kind of weapon, one which combined the volume of fire and full auto controllability of a machine gun with the accuracy of a rifle, at least over moderate ranges. Interestingly, both nations approached the same problem from opposite ends. Unlike most armies, the tactical structure of the German Wehrmacht was organized not around the rifleman, but rather the machine gun squad, with rifle-carrying infantry playing a supporting role. This is a major reason army planners chose to retain the Great War era Mauser 1898 pattern bolt-action rifle rather than adopt a more modern semi-automatic infantry weapon. But while this arrangement worked well during the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939, 1940 and 1941, it proved less effective in 1943 as the Wehrmacht found itself in full-on retreat following the disaster at Stalingrad. Though the German MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns could lay down an impressive volume of fire, they required extensive setup before they could be brought to bear, something that was difficult to do while retreating. German industry thus set about designing a more compact, man-portable machine gun that could be more easily used on the retreat. Fortuitously, the basic elements for such a weapon were already in development. In 1938, the Polt Ammunition Works in Magdeburg designed a new kind of ammunition, designated the 7.92 by 33mm Kurz, or short. This was essentially a cut-down version of the standard full-power 7.92 by 57mm Mauser cartridge used in German bolt-action rifles and machine guns, with a shorter case and a lighter bullet. This provided a balance between recoil and accuracy, allowing an infantryman to lay down controllable automatic fire from the shoulder while still being able to accurately hit targets out to 300 meters. In 1940, the German government issued contracts to firms Haenel and Walther to produce prototypes of a rifle to fire the new Kurz cartridge, to be designated the Maschine Karbiner, or Machine Carbine 42. Both companies produced similar weapons which looked unlike anything that had come before them. Both were gas-operated, built of lightweight and inexpensive welded steel stampings, and featured an inline shoulder stock, low-slung barrel to reduce muzzle climb, and a long, curved 30-round detachable box magazine. Both companies' prototypes were extensively tested at the Kummersdorf Proving Grounds in December 1940, and the results were less than impressive, with the weapons suffering a large number of jams, burst barrels, and other failures. Undaunted, Walther and Haenel continued to refine their designs, and in April 1942, the Haenel weapon was judged reliable enough for combat trials, first seeing service on the Eastern Front south of Leningrad. The reaction of the first troops to use the new weapon was overwhelmingly positive, and they requested that more MKB-42s be sent to the front immediately. Unfortunately, the entire program fell victim to the greatest of enemies to the German war effort, Adolf Hitler, who ordered all new rifle development programs suspended. The reason for this decision is hotly debated among historians, with some arguing that Hitler, having been a soldier in the Great War himself, was suspicious of new technology and believed that the standard KAR-98K bolt-action rifle was perfectly adequate for the German infantryman's needs. Others, however, claim that his decision was a far more pragmatic one. German forces had lost vast quantities of rifles and other weapons during the retreat from Stalingrad, greatly straining the capacity of German industry to replace them. Introducing a new pattern of rifle which required brand new tooling and manufacturing facilities would only make the situation worse and result in too few new rifles being produced to have any significant impact on the war effort. Hitler thus limited research and development efforts to upgraded models of submachine guns. Believing they had a winning weapon on their hands, Haenel made the bold decision to go behind the Führer's back and continue development of the MKB-42 under the designation of Maschinenpistol, or Machine Pistol 43. In order to address the issue of manufacturing capacity, Haenel attempted to develop the MP-43 into a complete replacement for the KAR-98K, fitting it with a grenade-launching attachment, mounts for telescopic sights, and a bayonet lug. Unfortunately, the rifle proved fundamentally unsuited to sniping, bayonet fighting, or grenade launching, and it was decided that the MP-43 could only ever supplement the KAR-98K, not replace it. In March of 1943, Hitler discovered Haenel's deception and ordered the project shut down once again. However, he was eventually persuaded to allow development to continue on an evaluation basis only. But the results of early trials proved so promising that Hitler approved the weapon for mass production, the first examples entering combat in October 1943. Once again, the reaction from frontline soldiers was overwhelmingly positive, so much so that when Hitler asked his Eastern Front generals in July 1944 what they needed most, one general immediately exclaimed, "More of these new rifles." Hitler soon warmed up to the MP-43 concept and, recognizing the propaganda value of this new weapon, requested that it be given a new name, the Sturmgewehr, or assault rifle. Nearly 426,000 SGG-44 rifles were produced by the end of the war, and while they proved extremely effective in combat, by the time they entered service, the war for Germany was already lost, and the new weapon had little to no impact on the final outcome of the conflict. However, the basic concept of a select-fire rifle firing an intermediate cartridge, as well as the name assault rifle, was to have major impact on the future of firearms design. Meanwhile, a similar development was taking place in the Soviet Union. Recognizing, as the Germans had, the need for a cartridge halfway between a pistol and rifle in power, in 1943 the Soviet OKB-44 Design Bureau developed the intermediate 7.62 by 39mm cartridge for use in a planned family of new infantry weapons, including a semi-automatic rifle, an automatic rifle, and a light machine gun. The cartridge, along with the semi-automatic SKS rifle, designed by Sergei Simonov, first entered combat in limited numbers in 1945 during the final battle against Nazi Germany. The rounds performed well, and in 1949 the SKS was officially adopted as the Red Army standard rifle, alongside the RPD light machine gun firing the same rounds. However, the SKS would prove extremely short-lived in frontline service, thanks to the development of a weapon that would go on to become legendary. In October 1943, tank commander Mikhail Kalashnikov was recovering in hospital from shoulder wounds received during the Battle of Bryansk. With plenty of time on his hands, Kalashnikov decided to solve what he saw as a major deficiency in Soviet armaments and designed a new type of submachine gun for the Red Army. I was in the hospital, and a soldier in the bed beside me asked, "Why do our soldiers have only one rifle for 2 or 3 of our men, when the Germans have automatics?" So I designed one. I was a soldier, and I created a machine gun for a soldier. While Kalashnikov's submachine gun was not accepted into service, his talent as a designer was recognized, and he was reassigned to the Red Army's Central Scientific Development Firing Range for Rifle Firearms of the Chief Artillery Directorate. In 1944, Kalashnikov became aware of the 7.62 by 39mm intermediate cartridge and redesigned his submachine gun to accommodate it. The resulting weapon looked very similar to the German STG-44, with an inline stock, low-slung barrel, and curved 30-round magazine. Whether Kalashnikov was directly influenced by the German weapon is debatable, with most historians attributing the similarities to a case of convergent design, that is, of two designers coming up with similar solutions to the same problem. Indeed, the operating mechanism of the two rifles is quite different. The STG-44 uses a tipping bolt, and the Kalashnikov has a rotating bolt. However, it is worth noting that while the Germans were trying to create a machine gun that could be used at shorter ranges, Kalashnikov was trying to create a submachine gun that could be used at longer ranges. In 1946, Kalashnikov entered his design into a competition for a new infantry automatic rifle, which it eventually won. In 1947, the weapon was approved for service under the designation Automat Kalashnikova, or Kalashnikov's automatic rifle, 1947, better known as the AK-47. Trials of this new rifle began in 1948, and in 1949 the AK-47 was adopted as the Red Army's standard rifle, replacing the SKS after barely a year in service. The AK family of rifles would go on to become the most successful and widely produced firearms in history, renowned for their ruggedness, reliability, and ease of use. Millions were exported around the world by the Soviet Union, China, and other communist states. It can be found in war zones worldwide to this day. It's important to note here that while the weapon is popularly referred to as the AK-47, this designation technically applies to the first three patterns of the rifle. While the first AK-47 featured stamped steel construction like the STG-44, this proved unreliable and was quickly replaced by machined steel construction for the Type II in 1951 and the Type III in 1954. Then in 1959, Soviet manufacturers finally perfected the stamped steel technology and introduced the modernized AK, or AKM. This is the AK most commonly encountered around the world, the original AK-47 patterns being extremely rare. Yet despite the success of the STG-44 and the AK, it took several decades for the assault rifle concept to catch on in the West. American infantry doctrine had long emphasized individual marksmanship and firing accurately aimed shots over long distances over suppressing fire, and despite the lessons of urban close combat during World War II, the United States was reluctant to adopt an intermediate cartridge. In 1954, the US pressured the newly formed North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, into adopting the full-power 7.62 by 51 or .308 caliber cartridge as its infantry standard. The decision forced many NATO countries to abandon advanced assault rifle projects and adopt so-called battle rifles using full-power cartridges such as the Belgian FN FAL, German G3, and American M14, which was essentially an M1 Garand with a detachable box magazine and select fire capability. Unfortunately, these rifles proved less than ideal, the full-power .308 cartridge making them nigh uncontrollable in full automatic fire. This led many countries like the UK to delete the full automatic capability from their battle rifles altogether. The deficiencies of the battle rifle concept became glaringly obvious as the United States entered the Vietnam War, where the bulky wood-stocked M14 proved prone to snagging in heavy brush and warping in the tropical humidity. By contrast, the Chinese-supplied SKSs and AKs used by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army proved ideally suited to jungle warfare, being light, compact, reliable, and capable of controlled automatic fire. It quickly became clear to US commanders that the American answer to the AK was desperately needed. Thankfully, such a weapon was already in development. In 1954, Richard Boutelle, president of the Fairchild Engine and Aeroplane Corporation, created the Armalite division to explore the use of aluminium and other aerospace materials in firearms design. The division's first success came that same year when it designed the lightweight folding AR-5 and AR-7 survival rifles for use by US aircrew shot down behind enemy lines. In 1957, Armalite was invited to enter the competition for a new US Forces rifle to replace the World War II era M1 Garand, and to this end, designer Eugene Stoner produced the AR-10, a lightweight aluminium-bodied rifle firing the 7.62 by 51mm NATO round. While the AR-10 would ultimately lose out to the M14, that same year, General William G. Wyman, commander of the US Army Continental Command, put out a request for a lightweight automatic rifle to fire the newly developed 5.56 by 45mm or .223 caliber intermediate cartridge. Stoner scaled down the AR-10 design to create a new rifle called the AR-15, which, after extensive trials and conversion to fully automatic capability, was adopted into US service in 1964 as the M16. While the lightweight space-age weapon was initially disparaged by troops as the Mattel rifle, the M16 quickly proved its worth in the jungles of Vietnam, and Eugene Stoker's AR system has formed the basis of all standard US military service rifles to the present day. The rifle also set the trends for modern assault rifles, the 5.56 by 45mm cartridge being flatter shooting and more lightweight than the Russian 7.62 by 54, the latter feature allowing an infantryman to carry more ammunition. As a result, in 1974, the Soviet Union replaced the AKM with the AK-74, firing the broadly similar 5.45 by 39mm cartridge, and in 1980, NATO adopted the 5.56 by 45mm as its infantry standard, replacing the full-power 7.62 by 51. So all of this brings us back to our original question. Just what is an assault rifle? According to the standard US Army definition, to be classified as an assault rifle, a firearm must have three basic characteristics embodied in the original STG-44 and AK-47. Number 1, it must fire an intermediate cartridge with an effective range of at least 300 meters. 2, it must have select fire capability, that is, the ability to fire in fully automatic mode. And 3, it must have a high-capacity detachable box magazine. By this definition, most civilian versions of the widely demonized AR-15 are not, in fact, assault rifles, for while these rifles are designed to fire an intermediate cartridge and can be fitted with large-capacity magazines, the AR-15 is, by definition, a semi-automatic firearm. Furthermore, AR does not stand for assault rifle, as is widely believed, but rather armor-light rifle. Similarly, any firearm lacking one or more of the above characteristics cannot be classified as an assault rifle. For example, the original M14 has a detachable high-capacity magazine and select fire capability, but fires a full-power rifle cartridge, while the SKS, despite firing an intermediate cartridge, has only a 10-round fixed magazine and no select fire capability. Nor should assault rifles be confused with assault weapons, the latter being neither a technical or military term, but rather a political one. The term derives from the US Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, which defined assault weapons as those which possess one or more of the following features, among others: a pistol grip or thumbhole stock, a folding or telescopic stock, a grenade or flare launcher, a forward hand grip, a threaded barrel, a muzzle device such as a muzzle brake, flash hider, or suppressor, a bayonet mount, a barrel shroud that prevents burns to the operator, a manufactured unloaded weight of over 50 ounces, 1.41 kilograms for pistols. So as you might have noticed, few of those features in any way affect the actual mechanical operation or deadliness of a firearm, and instead merely serve to make it look tactical or scary compared to more traditional firearms used for hunting and other sporting purposes. Unsurprisingly, this purely cosmetic definition has led to a variety of nonsensical contradictions in the application of gun control laws. For example, the Ruger Mini 14, a scaled-down version of the M14 chambered for the 5.56 by 45mm cartridge, has rarely been targeted by assault weapons bans, despite firing the same cartridge and having roughly the same capabilities as the AR-15. The only major difference between the AR-15 and the Mini 14 is that the latter is typically sold with a traditional wooden stock, making it look less intimidating. None of this, of course, has any bearing on who should be able to own which firearms and why, and it is hardly the business of this channel to wade into the highly contentious gun control debate. But as with any fraught political topic, it's always best to approach the conversation from a position of knowledge rather than ignorance. For as a paragon of quality 1980s children's television once said, knowing is half the battle. It's a classic action movie scenario. Our hero, burdened with disarming the doomsday weapon, killing the bad guy, saving the love interest, or all three at once, must assault a building packed to the brim with armed goons. Thankfully, being the protagonist, our hero is also blessed with bottomless magazines and unfailing aim and proceeds to simply charge into the building, guns blazing. Without fail, every bullet finds its mark, sending legions of goons crumpling to the ground, dead, or if it's that kind of movie, rather flying across the room like ragdolls, their lifeless bodies smashing through walls and plate glass windows for maximum cinematic mayhem. While most of us are aware that this is not how a real-life gunfight would go down, just how removed from reality is this scene? Well, while it can easily be proven that no regular man-portable firearm can send a body flying across the room, in most cases, people will indeed crumple to the ground when they are shot. The reason for this might seem rather obvious, except for one puzzling fact. Regardless of where the bullets hit or whether said hits are immediately fatal, most people will still drop. Stranger still, scientists still aren't quite sure why. Welcome to one of the more surprising scientific mysteries of our modern age. Why do people drop when shot? First off, let's tackle the myth that a gunshot will send you flying across the room as if you've just been hit by a speeding freight train. The main reason this is impossible has to do with energy transfer. Most bullets are relatively small in diameter, usually less than 1 centimeter, and travel at extremely high speeds. For example, 352 meters per second for a 9mm parabellum handgun bullet and 954 meters per second for a 5.56mm NATO rifle bullet. This means that on impact, a tremendous amount of force is concentrated over a tiny cross-sectional area, allowing most bullets to easily slice through human flesh without transferring much of their energy to the victim's body. But even in cases where the bullet stops dead, such as when it impacts a particularly dense bone or a bulletproof vest, being so light, most bullets don't have nearly enough momentum to send a person flying across the room. To use an extreme example, let's imagine firing the massive 50 caliber BMG round used in the M2 heavy machine gun and Barrett M82 anti-material rifle at a person who's holding an armor plate, such that the bullet is stopped dead by the plate and transfers all of its energy to our hapless target. In such an inelastic collision, momentum, defined as mass times velocity, is conserved, meaning that after the collision, the combination of projectile and target will have the same momentum as they did before the collision. The 50 caliber bullet has a mass of 42 grams and a muzzle velocity of 928 meters per second, meaning it has a momentum of 38.9 kilogram meters per second. Dividing this momentum by the mass of the target, 98.9 kilograms for the average American male, yields a rearward velocity of 0.39 meters per second, meaning that in a frictionless environment, say wearing ice skates on a rink, the impact would propel our unfortunate cannon fodder rearward at a leisurely 1.4 kilometers per hour. Standing on solid ground, such an impact could certainly knock a person to the ground, but would be nowhere near powerful enough to fling them across the room. Indeed, this film trope is easily debunked by the fact that firearms are usable at all. According to Newton's third law of motion, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, meaning that if a bullet could send its victim flying across the room, the shooter would also be blown rearward with equal force by the recoil of the firearm. And if all of this theory still isn't enough to convince you that people getting blown across rooms is pure Hollywood ballyhoo, in a February 6, 2005 episode of the television series Mythbusters, this myth was physically tested by shooting various firearms at a dummy made of ballistics gel. In all cases, it was found that no practical handheld firearm produced enough muzzle energy to knock the dummy back more than a few inches. Achieving the classic Hollywood effect would require something on the order of a small artillery piece, at which point you'll no longer be blowing someone across the room so much as using their insides to redecorate the room. But anyway, back to the mystery at hand. While the obvious answer to the question, why do people drop when shot, is, duh, Simon, because they've been shot, in reality, the physiology of gunshot wounds is far more complicated than it might first appear. There are relatively few parts of the human body where a bullet impact will produce instantaneous death, these being certain parts of the brain, spinal cord, and heart. But a great many people have survived hits to both organs, for a time at least, with the cause of death in the vast majority of gunshot cases being exsanguination, aka blood loss. Yet time and time again in military conflicts or criminal police and accidental shootings, people will crumple to the ground or when shot in places which are not immediately lethal. Of course, in some cases the person was shot in the legs and simply collapsed due to extreme pain or because their bones were broken and they could no longer support their weight. But the same phenomena is observed in people shot in the chest, abdomen, and arms. Theoretically, such people should be able to carry on walking for some time before passing out from blood loss, especially if their system is full of adrenaline. So, what exactly causes them to drop? Interestingly, the leading theory as to why people drop when shot holds that the phenomena is purely psychological, rooted in popular depictions of gun violence. Because people in movies and TV shows drop instantly when they're shot, when people are shot in real life, they too drop to the ground because that is what's supposed to happen. This theory, posited by American ballistics expert Duncan McPherson, is supported by the fact that animals, which have no conception of how firearms or gunshot wounds work, react differently from humans to being shot. As any hunter can attest, deer shot through the heart can run up to 50 meters before blood loss takes it down. The same holds for humans who have little exposure to firearms. For example, from 1899 to 1913, the United States military fought a protracted counterinsurgency in the Philippines against a group of fiercely independent Muslim tribesmen known as the Moros. During early battles, American troops were shocked to discover that the 30 caliber Krag Jorgensen and M1903 Springfield rifles and 38 caliber M1892 revolvers did little to stop the hordes of charging Moros, with multiple shots being needed to take down a single man. As Colonel Louis A. Lagarde of the Army Medical Corps reported in 1905, Antonio Caspia, a prisoner of the island of Samar PI, attempted to escape on the 26th of October 1905. He was shot 4 times at close range in hand-to-hand encounter by a 38 Colts revolver loaded with US Army regulation ammunition. He was finally stunned by a blow on the forehead from the butt of a Springfield carbine. On many occasions, Moro berserkers known as juramentados were able to charge through a hail of bullets and cut down a handful of Americans before finally dying of their wounds. The same phenomena was encountered by American troops deployed to China in 1900, where they faced equally fanatical and seemingly bulletproof anti-colonial rebels known as the Boxers. It's now believed that naivete regarding the effects of firearms coupled with adrenaline and religious or nationalistic fervor allowed the Moros and the Boxers to ignore their wounds and keep fighting until physiology took its inevitable toll. The experience of fighting in the Philippines and China convinced the US military that it needed a harder-hitting pistol cartridge capable of knocking a man down with one shot. Thus, in 1904, Colonel John Thompson, head of the Army Ordnance Department and later inventor of the famous Thompson submachine gun or Tommy gun, conducted a series of tests with Major Lagarde to evaluate the stopping power of various handgun cartridges. And for more on Colonel Thompson and his most famous creation, please do check out our previous video, The Chicago Typewriter, the story of the legendary Tommy gun. These tests, conducted at the Union Stockyards in Chicago, involved firing various cartridges at live cattle and hordes as well as human cadavers and noting how long the animals took to die or how far back the cadavers were pushed by the bullet impact. The results revealed that hollow point or dum-dum bullets which expand on impact were most effective, but as such projectiles were prohibited in warfare by the 1899 Hague Convention, Thompson and Lagarde recommended that the Army adopt a cartridge no smaller than 45 caliber. This recommendation eventually led to the adoption of the 45 ACP cartridge and the legendary Colt M1911 automatic pistol. While the naivete theory for why most people drop when shot is by far the most popular, other experts argue that dropping is simply a logical reaction to trauma and danger. Simply put, dropping to the ground allows the victim to guard and tend to their wounds and avoid getting shot at again. Still others, however, reject psychological explanations altogether and instead posit a purely physiological reason for why people drop when shot. For example, Dr. Dennis Tobin, a neurologist at the Citizens Medical Center in Victoria, Texas, theorizes that the common reaction to being shot is due to a structure in the brain known as the reticular activating system, or RAS. Located in the brainstem, the RAS filters out irrelevant information pouring in from our senses, preventing our brains from becoming overloaded. So, if you're able to listen in on a single conversation in a crowd or sleep next to a busy highway, thank your RAS. The gunshot wound typically produces a large amount of pain and other trauma, unleashing a barrage of nerve impulses which can quickly overwhelm the brain. Certain projectiles can even unleash powerful pressure waves which can travel through the body and potentially damage delicate brain structures. This is especially true of small high-velocity rounds like 5.56mm NATO, which can momentarily create large cavities as they pass through tissue, inflicting significant damage. According to Dr. Tobin, in order to protect the brain from this onslaught, the RAS immediately shuts down all non-essential bodily functions, including maintaining muscle tone. This causes the leg muscles to suddenly weaken, the shooting victim to collapse. This theory is supported by research done in 1988 by A.M. Garanson and in 2004 by a team from the University of Science and Technology in Hefei, China, and any animal lovers in the audience might want to turn the video off right now. It's going to get a bit grim. Go on then. Okay, let's carry on. Both studies involved shooting live pigs and dogs in the legs with real bullets and measuring the effects on their brains. Whether psychological, physiological, or a bit of both, the real reason most people drop when shot remains as elusive as ever, largely because most of the data we have on the subject comes from anecdotal military reports or experiments conducted on animals. For other understandable reasons, people aren't exactly lining up around the corner to be shot for science, and even if they were, no ethics review board on the planet is going to approve such an experiment. But whatever the real answer is, I think we can all agree on one thing. It's probably a good idea to just not get shot. In the 2008 film Wanted, mild-mannered office worker Wesley Gibson, played by James McAvoy, is inducted into a secret organisation of elite assassins known as the Fraternity, who keep the world in balance by eliminating those who threaten its safety. Among the superhuman skills Wesley learns is the ability to curve bullets by swinging his pistol as he fires, allowing him to hit targets behind hidden obstacles. While this makes for a great cinematic visual, is it actually possible to do this? Can you actually curve a bullet like a pitcher curves a baseball? The short answer to that is no, at least not in the way shown in the movie. But there is a caveat that we'll get into in just a bit. But for now, the reason has to do with plain old inertia. When an object is set in motion, it will travel in a straight line unless some force acts upon it. Thus, no matter how fast you swing your gun while firing, the bullet will fly in the same direction as it was traveling at the moment it left the barrel. Once in free flight, there are only two major forces that can affect a bullet's trajectory: gravity and air resistance. Gravity, of course, pulls the bullet toward the center of the Earth, causing it to travel in a downward arcing trajectory. Wind resistance, however, specifically from a crosswind, can cause the bullet's trajectory to curve sideways. This is called windage, and the sights of nearly all rifles are designed to be adjustable to compensate for this effect. However, due to the high density, small surface area, and high velocity of most bullets, windage is only significant over long distances and would be useless for curving a bullet around, say, Angelina Jolie. Similarly, another force that can affect bullets, at least modern spin-stabilized ones, is the Magnus effect, the same aerodynamic phenomenon that causes golf balls to slice, baseballs to curve, and soccer balls, football to our non-American viewers, to bend into the net. However, for a cylindrical bullet spinning around its longitudinal axis, the Magnus effect acts either upwards or downwards, not sideways. To achieve a sideways curve, a gun would need to fire a spherical projectile spinning around its vertical axis. But again, so high are the inertial forces compared to the aerodynamic forces acting on a bullet that this curve would be very gradual and only become apparent over long ranges. To make the curve more pronounced at short range, you must make the projectile much larger and far less dense, creating essentially a Nerf gun. Of course, there is a third way to make a bullet curve in flight: the Coriolis effect. Known to most people as the phenomenon that apparently makes toilets flush in a different direction in the southern hemisphere, spoiler alert, it doesn't. In this case, the Coriolis effect is the result of the Earth rotating beneath the projectile as it flies, making it seem as though it is traveling along a curved trajectory. But once again, this effect only occurs over very long distances and is useless in a wanted type gunfight. So, in conclusion, there is no practical way to bend a regular bullet over the short distances as depicted in Wanted. Sorry, all you would-be super assassins, you'll just have to take out your targets the old-fashioned way. But wait! I hear you saying, if you can't curve a bullet by swinging a gun around, what about bending the barrel to shoot around corners? Well, as goofy as it may sound, this is actually possible and has been tried several times throughout history. During the First World War, armies on both sides extensively experimented with so-called periscope rifles to allow soldiers to shoot over the rim of a trench without exposing themselves to enemy fire. These typically consisted of a wooden or metal frame holding a regular service rifle, and it would be fitted with a periscopic sight and various levers connected to the bolt and trigger to allow said rifle to be safely operated from below. But while this fits the technical definition of shooting around corners, none of these devices made use of a curved barrel to bend the bullet's trajectory, though they did result in some rather interesting guns. The first patent for a curved barrel firearm would not be until 1919, filed by inventor Alexander T. Fisher of Detroit, Michigan. Dubbed a device for oblique firing, Fisher's design included a periscopic sight so that firearms fitted with the system could be fired, quote, at an angle from that of the line of sight as is now practiced. This improvement is especially desirable in airplane use in war, as it enables the observer to shoot over the side of the airplane and direct his bullet to an object beneath him without being obliged to hold the firearm in a vertical or nearly vertical position and without being exposed to fire from his adversary. Soldiers also, by its use, may fire over parapets without exposure to adverse fire. This description suggests that Fisher was naively ignorant of the realities of aerial combat, for by 1919, the days of aircraft observers firing at ground targets with regular rifles was long past. And unless the observer's compartment was armored, which few 1910s aircrafts were, hiding behind its edge would make little difference to the gunner's safety. And while Fisher's invention was theoretically better suited to infantry use, there is no evidence of a working example ever being built. It would not be until the 1940s that a working curved barrel firearm was actually fielded by, who other than the Nazis. Known as the Krummlauf, literally meaning curved barrel, this device was the brainchild of Hans Schaeder of Dusseldorf weapons manufacturer Rheinmetall Borsig, with development beginning in 1943. As it was believed that bending a regular barrel would impart too much stress on it and the bullet, the first prototypes used a curved piece of 20mm barrel as a trough to help guide the 8mm bullet around a corner. However, this did not work nearly as well as planned, and it was soon discovered that simply using a curved 8mm barrel actually worked much better. The curve still placed tremendous stress on the barrel extension, so relief holes were drilled to release some of the pressure. As the Krummlauf was only intended for short-range use, the resulting loss of velocity and accuracy was not considered a major problem. Several different versions of the Krummlauf were developed, broadly divided into I variants for infantry and P or Panzer variants for use aboard armoured vehicles. 30, 45, 60, and 90-degree versions were designed as well as special mountings for the MG42 machine gun and the STG-44 assault rifle. More on the fascinating history of assault rifles in the bonus facts in just a bit. The 90-degree P Krummlaufs were specifically designed for use in tank destroyers like the Porsche Elephant, which was not fitted with defensive machine guns. Mounted in a special swiveling cupola fitted with a periscope, an STG-44 fitted with a Krummlauf allowed the vehicle crew to defend themselves against attacking infantry while keeping the weapon vertical, minimizing the space it occupied inside the hull. In the end, however, only the 30-degree I variant for the STG-44 was produced in any significant numbers, and even then, of the 20,000 initially ordered, only around 500 ever made it into the field. Intended for use in urban warfare, the I Krummlauf featured a 35cm barrel comprising a 10cm straight section, a 14cm curved section, and another 11cm straight section. This clamped over the front sight and muzzle of the STG-44 using the same mount as the German Army's standard Scheissberger grenade launching cup. While early on efforts were made to line up the rifling of the weapon and the Krummlauf, this was eventually found to be unnecessary, and production versions actually featured a short bored-out section between the muzzle of the weapon and the start of the curved barrel to allow the bullet to recenter itself. And to allow the infantryman to see what he was shooting at, the Krummlauf was fitted with a periscopic mirror in sheet metal housing. This in turn featured a triangular shield to prevent gases from the barrel from clouding the optics. Like many German Wunderwaffe, the Krummlauf arrived too late and in far too numbers to have any impact on the end of the war. However, the Allies took a keen interest in the odd-looking design, with both Americans and Russians conducting extensive tests on captured examples. The results were something of a mixed bag. While comfortable to shoot and capable of achieving 35 by 35 centimeter grouping at a range of 100 meters when fired in semi-automatic mode, the 30-degree I Krummlauf became uncontrollable in fully automatic mode, the sideways recoil spinning the shooter dangerously to the side. The powerful forces in the curved barrel also tended to tear the bullets into fragments, though this unintended shotgun effect was theoretically useful in close-quarters urban combat. However, these same forces also caused the barrel to very quickly wear out. Though originally designed to last 6,000 shots, in practice, most Krummlaufs failed after just a few hundred. In his final report, Colonel H.A. Quinn of Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland concluded that, despite the fact that the bent barrel theory is in violation of accepted ideas on bullet delivery, it is believed to be worthy of extensive research and development. With the short length, large diameter, and short bearing of the 230-grain US caliber 45 bullet, various degrees of bent barrels might prove to be successful and with reasonable control. With the 7.9mm Kurz Patronen bullet, it is believed that the 30-degree bend is practical. The 90-degree bend is apparently impractical. The Soviets came to similar conclusions and produced experimental versions of the Mosin Nagant 9130 and the AVS-36 rifles and the PPSH-41 submachine gun with 30-degree curved barrels. However, neither the US nor the Red Army chose to pursue the idea any further. But if curving a firearms barrel around a corner is impractical, why not just bend the whole firearm? This was the thinking of Israeli Defense Forces Lieutenant Colonel and counter-terrorist expert Amos Golan when he created one of the most unique weapons currently in service, the corner shot. Introduced in the year 2000, the corner shot is not a weapon per se, but rather a rifle-like chassis with a forward section designed to hold a standard pistol like a Glock 17 or Beretta 92F. This section is hinged to allow the attached firearm to fire around corners and incorporates a high-definition television camera connected to a screen on the rear of the device to allow the operator to see what they're shooting at. And if that weren't bizarre enough, among the many accessories created for the corner shot is the kitty corner shot, a stuffed animal resembling a cat designed to be slipped over the muzzle of the pistol. The idea is that when the kitty corner shot is pushed around a corner, it will distract the target just long enough for the corner shot gunner to get them in their sights. And if you ask us, when someone starts coming up with ideas that unhinged, it is they, not the bullets, that are truly going around the bend. Bonus fact. Speaking of innovative weapons, what we now call assault rifles can trace their origins back to the Second World War. While that conflict is remembered for introducing advanced technologies like radar, jet aircraft, and nuclear weapons, the average infantryman went into World War II armed essentially with the same weapon that his parents had used in the last war, a bolt-action, manually repeating rifle firing a full-power cartridge. The only major exception was the United States, which in 1936 became the first nation to issue a semi-automatic rifle, the M1 Garand, as its standard infantry weapon. But while such weapons were well suited to shooting across no man's land during the Great War, or on the South African veldt during the Boer War, in the increasingly urban close-quarters combat troops increasingly found themselves engaged in, bolt-action rifles quickly became something of a liability. Not only were they slow and awkward to operate, severely limiting the volume of fire that could be laid down, but the full-power cartridges they fired, great for precision shots over long distances, were grossly overpowered, with army reports indicating that few combat engagements occurred at ranges over 300 meters. Such cartridges also made fully automatic weapons all but uncontrollable when fired from the shoulder. Thankfully, most armies had another class of weapon in their arsenal, the submachine gun. Developed at the end of the Great War for raiding and clearing trenches, the submachine gun fired lower recoil, pistol caliber ammunition and could deliver a murderous volume of fire at close quarters, making them ideal for urban combat. This advantage was exploited to great effect by the Soviet Red Army, who equipped entire infantry companies with PPSH-41 and 43 submachine guns for house-to-house fighting in cities like Stalingrad. But submachine guns were not a perfect solution, being inaccurate at ranges beyond a few dozen meters. Both the Soviets and the Germans quickly realized that this new kind of combat required a new kind of weapon, one which combines the volume of fire and full auto-controllability of a submachine gun with the accuracy of a rifle, at least over moderate ranges. Interestingly, both nations approached the problem from the opposite ends. Unlike most armies, the tactical structure of the German Wehrmacht was organized not around their riflemen, but rather the machine gun squad, with rifle-carrying infantry playing a supporting role. This is a major reason army planners chose to retain the Great War-era Mauser 1898 pattern bolt-action rifle rather than adopt a more modern semi-automatic infantry weapon. But while this arrangement worked well during the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939, 1940, and 1941, it proved less effective in 1943. As the Wehrmacht found itself in full-on retreat following the disaster at Stalingrad. Though the German MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns could lay down an impressive volume of fire, they required extensive setup before they could be brought to bear, something that was difficult to do while retreating. German industry thus set about designing a more compact, man-portable machine gun that could be more easily used on the retreat. Fortuitously, the basic elements for such a weapon were already in development. In 1938, the Polter Ammunition Works in Magdeburg designed a new kind of ammunition designated the 7.92 by 33mm Kurz, or short. This was essentially a cut-down version of the standard full-power 7.92 by 57mm Mauser cartridge used in German bolt-action rifles and machine guns, with a shorter case and a lighter bullet. This provided a balance between recoil and accuracy, allowing an infantryman to lay down controllable automatic fire from the shoulder while still being able to accurately hit targets out to 300 meters. In 1940, the German government issued contracts to firms Heinel and Walther to produce prototypes of a rifle to fire the new Kurz cartridge, to be designated the Machine Carabiner or Machine Carbine 42. Both companies produced similar weapons, which looked unlike anything that had come before. Both were gas-operated, built of lightweight and inexpensive welded steel stampings, and feature an inline shoulder stock, low-slung barrel to reduce muzzle climb, and a long, curved 30-round attachable box magazine. Both companies' prototypes were extensively tested at Kummersdorf Proving Grounds in December 1940, and the results were, well, less than impressive, with the weapon suffering a large number of jams, burst barrels, and other failures. Undaunted, Walther and Heinel continued to refine their designs, and in April 1942, the Heinel weapon was judged reliable enough for combat trials, first seeing service on the Eastern Front south of Leningrad. The reaction of the first troops to this new weapon was overwhelmingly positive, and they requested that more MKB-42s be sent to the front immediately. Unfortunately, the entire program fell victim to that greatest of enemies of the German war effort, Adolf Hitler, who ordered all new rifle development programs suspended. The reason for this decision is hotly debated among historians, with some arguing that Hitler, having been a soldier in the Great War himself, was suspicious of new technology and believed that the standard KAR-98K bolt-action rifle was perfectly adequate for German infantrymen's needs. Others, however, claimed that his decision was a far more pragmatic one. German forces had lost vast quantities of rifles and other weapons during the retreat from Stalingrad, greatly straining the capacity of German industry to replace them. Introducing a new pattern of rifle, which required brand new tooling and manufacturing facilities, facilities would only make the situation worse and result in too few new rifles being produced to have any significant impact on the war effort. Hitler thus limited research and development efforts to upgraded models of submachine guns. Believing they had a winning weapon on their hands, Hainault made the bold decision to go behind the Führer's back and continue development of the MKB-42 under the designation of Maschinenpistol, or Machine Pistol 43. In order to address the issue of manufacturing capacity, Hainault attempted to develop the MP-43 into a complete replacement for the KAR-98K, fitting it with a grenade-launching attachment, mounts for telescopic sights, and a bayonet lug. Unfortunately, the rifle proved fundamentally unsuited to sniping, bayonet fighting, or grenade launching, and it was reluctantly decided that the MP-43 could only ever supplement the KAR-98K, not replace it. In March 1943, Hitler discovered Hainault's deception and ordered the project shut down once again. However, he was eventually persuaded to allow development to continue on an evaluation basis only. But the results of early trials proved so promising that Hitler approved the weapon for mass production, the first examples entering combat in October 1943. Once again, the reaction from frontline soldiers was overwhelmingly positive, so much so that when Hitler asked his German front generals in July 1944 what they needed most, one general immediately exclaimed, "More of those new rifles." Hitler soon warmed to the MP-43 concept and, recognizing the propaganda value of this new weapon, requested that it be given a new name, the Sturmgewehr, or assault rifle. Nearly 426,000 STG-44 rifles were produced by the end of the war, and while they proved extremely effective in combat, by the time they entered service, the war for Germany was already lost, and the new weapon had little to no impact on the final outcome of the conflict. However, the basic concept of a select-fire rifle firing an intermediate cartridge, as well as the name assault rifle, was to have a major impact on the future of firearms design. Meanwhile, a similar development was taking place in the Soviet Union. Recognizing, as the Germans had, the need for a cartridge halfway between a pistol and a rifle in power, in 1943 the Soviet OKB-44 Design Bureau developed the intermediate 7.62 by 39mm cartridge for use in a planned family of new infantry weapons, including a semi-automatic rifle, an automatic rifle, and a light machine gun. The cartridge, along with the semi-automatic SKS rifle, designed by Sergei Simonov, first entered combat in limited numbers in 1945 during the final battles against Nazi Germany. The rounds performed well, and in 1949 the SKS was officially adopted as the Red Army's standard rifle, alongside the RPD light machine gun firing that same round. However, the SKS would prove extremely short-lived in frontline service thanks to the development of a weapon that would go on to become legendary. In October 1941, tank commander Mikhail Kalashnikov was recovering in hospital from shoulder wounds received during the Battle of Bryansk. With plenty of time on his hands, Kalashnikov decided to solve what he saw as a major deficiency in Soviet armaments and designed a new type of submachine gun for the Red Army. I was in the hospital, and a soldier in the bed beside me asked, "Why do our soldiers have only one rifle for 2 or 3 of our men, when the Germans have automatics?" So, I designed one. I was a soldier, and I created a machine gun for a soldier. While Kalashnikov's submachine gun was not accepted into service, his talent as a designer was recognized, and he was reassigned to the Red Army's Central Scientific Development Firing Range for Rifle Firearms of the Chief Artillery Directorate. In 1944, Kalashnikov became aware of the 7.62 by 39mm intermediate cartridge and redesigned his submachine gun to accommodate it. The resulting weapon looked very similar to the German STG-44 with an inline stock, low-slung barrel and curved 30-barrel magazine. Whether Kalashnikov was directly influenced by the German weapon is debatable, with most historians attributing the similarities to a case of convergent design, that is, of two designers coming up with similar solutions to the same problem. Indeed, the operating mechanism of the two rifles is quite different, the STG-44 using a tipping bolt and the Kalashnikov a rotating bolt. However, it is worth noting, while the Germans were trying to create a machine gun that could be used at shorter ranges, Kalashnikov was trying to create a submachine gun that could be used at longer ranges. In 1946, Kalashnikov entered his design into a competition for a new infantry automatic rifle, which it eventually won. In 1947, the weapon was approved for service under the designation Avtomat Kalashnikova, or Kalashnikov's Automatic Rifle 1947, better known, of course, as the AK-47. Trials of the new rifle began in 1948, and in 1949 the AK-47 was adopted as the Red Army's standard rifle, replacing the SKS after barely a year in service. The AK family of rifles would go on to become the most successful and widely produced firearms in history, renowned for their ruggedness, reliability, and ease of use. Millions were exported around the world by the Soviet Union, China, and other communist states, and can be found in war zones worldwide to this day. It is important to note here that while the weapon is popularly referred to as the AK-47, the designation technically applies to the first 3 patterns of the rifle. While the first AK-47 featured stamped steel construction like the STG-44, this proved unreliable and was quickly replaced by machined steel construction for the Type 2 in 1951 and the Type 3 in 1954. Then in 1959, Soviet manufacturers finally perfected the stamped steel technology and introduced the modernized AK or AKM. This is the AK most commonly encountered around the world, the original AK-47 patterns being extremely rare. Yet, despite the success of the STG-44 and the AK, it still took several decades for the assault rifle concept to catch on in the West. American infantry doctrine had long emphasized individual marksmanship and firing accurately aimed shots over long distances, over suppressing fire, and despite the lessons of urban close combat during World War II, the United States was reluctant to adopt an intermediate cartridge. In 1954, the US pressurized the newly formed North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, into adopting the full-power 7.62 by 51 or 308 caliber cartridge as its infantry standard. This decision forced many NATO countries to abandon advanced assault rifle projects and adopt so-called battle rifles, firing full-power cartridges such as the Belgian FN-FAL, German G3, and American M14, which was essentially an M1 Garand with a detachable box magazine and select fire capabilities. Unfortunately, these rifles proved less than ideal, the full-power 308 cartridge making them nigh uncontrollable in fully automatic mode. This led to many countries like the UK to delete the full automatic capability from their battle rifles altogether. The deficiencies of the battle rifle concept became glaringly obvious as the United States entered the Vietnam War, where the bulky wood-stocked M14 proved prone to snagging in heavy brush and warping in the tropical humidity. By contrast, the Chinese-supplied SKSs and AKs used by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army proved ideally suited to jungle warfare, being light, compact, reliable, and capable of controlled automatic fire. It quickly became clear to US commanders that an American answer to the AK was desperately needed. Thankfully, just such a weapon was already in development. In 1954, Richard Beutel, president of the Fairchild Engine and Airplane Corporation, created the Armalite division to explore the use of aluminium and other aerospace materials in firearms design. The division's first success came that same year when it designated the lightweight folding AR-5 and AR-7 survival rifles for use by US aircrew shot down behind enemy lines. In 1957, Armalite was invited to enter the competition for a new US Forces rifle to replace the World War II-era M1 Garand, and to this end, designer Eugene Stoner produced the AR-10, a lightweight, aluminium-bodied rifle firing the 7.62 by 51mm NATO round. While the AR-10 would ultimately lose out to the M14, that same year, General Willard G. Wyman, commander of the US Army Continental Command, put out a request for a lightweight automatic rifle to fire the newly developed 5.56 by 45mm or .223 caliber intermediate cartridge. Stoner scaled down the AR-10 design to create a new rifle called the AR-15, which, after extensive trials and conversion to full automatic capability, was adopted into US service in 1964 as the M16. While the lightweight space-age weapon was initially disparaged by troops as the Mattel rifle, the M16 quickly proved its worth in the jungles of Vietnam, and Eugene Stoner's AR system has formed the basis for all standard US military service rifles up to the present day. The rifle also set the trend for modern assault rifles, the 5.56 by 45mm cartridge being flatter shooting and more lightweight than the Russian 7.62 by 54mm, the latter feature allowing an infantryman to carry more ammunition. As a result, in 1974, the Soviet Union replaced the AKM with the AK-74, firing the broadly similar 5.45 by 39mm cartridge, and in 1980, NATO adopted the 5.56 by 45mm as its infantry standard, replacing the full-power 7.62 by 51. And if you're now wondering what actually makes something an assault rifle, well, according to the US Army definition, to be classified as an assault rifle, a firearm must have 3 basic characteristics embodied in the original STG-44 and AK-47. 1, it must fire an intermediate cartridge with an effective range of at least 300 meters. 2, it must have select fire capability, that is, the ability to fire in fully automatic mode. And 3, it must have a high-capacity detachable box magazine. By this definition, most civilian versions of the widely demonized AR-15 are not in fact assault rifles, for while these rifles are designed to fire an intermediate cartridge and can be fitted with large capacity magazines, the AR-15 is by definition a semi-automatic firearm. Further, AR does not stand for assault rifle, as is widely believed, but rather Armalite rifle. Similarly, any firearm lacking one or more of the above characteristics cannot be classified as an assault rifle. For example, the original M14 has a detachable high-capacity magazine and select fire capability, but fires a full-power cartridge, while the SKS, despite firing an intermediate cartridge, has only a 10-round fixed magazine and no select fire capability. And nor should assault rifles be confused with assault weapons, the latter being neither a technical or military term, but rather just a political one. Utilised the world over, rubber bullets and stun guns are controversial additions to the arsenals of police forces and militaries due to their tendency to do the exact opposite of what they're designed to do. Rather than be non-lethal, they occasionally kill people that they're being levelled against. But how dangerous are they really? As for rubber bullets, invented by the British Ministry of Defence in the 1970s, they have been a near constant source of controversy. For example, during the Troubles, a decidedly British-sounding name commonly given to a conflict between the British Army and the Irish paramilitary forces that occurred in the 1970s, rubber bullets killed an estimated 17 people. This was the first time rubber bullets were ever utilised on a large scale. Yet, despite the many deaths, they somehow still caught on as the de facto non-lethal option for armies and police forces all around the globe. To help mitigate the whole lethal force issue, British soldiers used them during the Troubles, and they were instructed to fire them at the feet of whoever they were trying to incapacitate. The idea being to bounce the rubber bullet off the ground and strike a target in the leg somewhere. As you could probably imagine, bullets fired in this manner didn't always bounce as intended, and reports of people being struck in, shall we say, more sensitive areas of the body were commonplace throughout the conflict. Of course, many soldiers ignored the ground bouncing recommendation entirely, aiming for a target center mass instead of firing the bullet at the floor as instructed. This further compounded the whole death and serious injury issue. There's an idea of the kind of injuries rubber bullets are capable of causing, along with killing numerous individuals during the Troubles and beyond. Rubber bullets also left many disfigured, paralyzed, and even blinded. In 1991, the MOD responded to criticisms about the lethality of the supposedly non-lethal weapons it was deploying in the conflict, and found that along with rubber bullets being far more dangerous than they'd anticipated, the specially made guns used to fire them were wildly inaccurate. How inaccurate, you ask? Well, one study found that rubber bullets would fly about a foot off course when fired from a distance of less than 90 feet. In response, the British Army replaced the weapon used to fire rubber bullets, but not the bullets themselves. Since then, technology has progressed somewhat, and today rubber bullets are commonly made of other materials such as plastic or cloth filled with ball bearings. As such, although the term rubber bullet is commonly used as a catch-all term for this kind of ammunition, baton round is a more accurate term used by police forces and militaries. That said, rubber and rubber-coated bullets are still commonly used in many parts of the world. It should further be noted that modern rubber bullets and baton rounds are no longer designed to be fired at the floor to avoid random ricochets, though they are still designed to be fired at a target's lower body and are often also designed to slow down significantly upon being shot. The idea being that when the bullet strikes a target, it will do so with enough force to cause injury, but not death or permanent injury. Despite this, studies indicate that in practice, rubber bullets and baton rounds are still quite inaccurate, since they're capable of inflicting serious harm. Unsurprisingly, from this 2000 study conducted by Israeli researchers found that injuries sustained by people struck by rubber bullets were all over the map, with injuries being reported everywhere from the head to the feet. As will come as a shock to exactly no one, shots to the head were noted as being especially dangerous, with 2 people in the study dying more or less on impact as a result of being struck in the head by a rubber bullet. These were results that were supported by a meta-analysis of other studies into the lethality of rubber bullets and other forms of non-lethal ammunition in 2017, conducted by researchers at the University of California. According to the research, so-called non-lethal projectiles are dangerous to almost a ludicrous degree. For example, one poignant statistic gleaned from the meta-study was that of the 1,984 individuals researchers found who'd been hit by a non-lethal projectile, 1 in 6 were left disabled in some way as a direct result of being struck by it, while 1 in 33 of the people struck by non-lethal projectiles died as a result. On top of this, the researchers noted that this particular latter statistic may not be truly representative of the danger non-lethal ammunition poses, largely because it's not standard practice for many police and military agencies the world over to register deaths caused by non-lethal ammunition. Thus, it's thought that the actual fatality figure is probably higher. Further, the researchers concluded that non-lethal ammunition should probably never be deployed against civilians due to its inaccuracy at range and tendency to ricochet and hit random, often innocent bystanders who are just minding their own business. In addition, Rahini Ha, the co-author of the paper, explained that trying to compensate for this by simply firing non-lethal ammunition at close range ultimately drastically increases the odds that it will cause serious injury or death. But here's the thing. This isn't something unique to rubber bullets, and it's noted that virtually every non-lethal weapon used by police and militaries around the world today can not only cause serious injury, but kill if used outside of the hyper-specific scenario that they're designed to be utilized in. Even something as seemingly innocuous as so-called pepper spray, for example, has killed countless people, with asthmatic individuals noted as being especially at risk of death if they inhale the noxious mixture. Meaning, in any given crowd, should an asthmatic person happen to be in it or in the vicinity when the crowd is sprayed, the authorities may as well have used their guns, with the mere fact of having the condition possibly making it a death sentence. Moving on, tear gas has also been linked to numerous deaths around the world. There's an aside, along with the gas itself being dangerous and in some cases lethal if inhaled for a prolonged period of time, the canister containing the gas can hilariously also be lethal in its own right, as it's often fired at high speed into a crowd with little regard for where it's going to land. As for other surprisingly lethal, non-lethal weapons, both tasers and stun guns have been linked to hundreds of deaths in the US alone since their introduction. On this one, there have been several reports showing that the use of high-voltage stun guns like the taser, known in the medical world as electronic control devices, ECDs, and that can occasionally cause cardiac arrest. Arguably, the most famous of such reports was published on April the 20th, 2012 in the American Heart Association's journal Circulation. In it, Dr. Douglas Zipes at the Indiana University School of Medicine reports on cases involving loss of consciousness by people who had ECDs used on them. His conclusion was, ECD stimulation can cause cardiac electrical capture and provoke cardiac arrest due to ventricular tachycardia, ventricular fibrillation. After prolonged ventricular tachycardia, ventricular fibrillation, without resuscitation, asystole develops. As you might expect, when Dr. Zipes published his paper, there was a large amount of controversy surrounding the topic. After all, it was long reported by manufacturers of ECDs that their products were non-lethal, with these entities generally stating something to the effect that while the voltage associated with their use was high, usually between 20,000 and 150,000 volts, the amperage, around 3 milliamps, was too low to cause any permanent damage. Law enforcement professionals were even sometimes instructed to use the devices on themselves before they were qualified to use them on the public. Cops everywhere thus began laughing at any new guy that had qualified on the weapon. In any event, in the report, Dr. Zipes was able to show that certain people are more susceptible to having this high-voltage, low-amperage electricity cause cardiac problems, such as those that have structural heart diseases, are taking medications or drugs that leave the heart irritable and susceptible to external stimulation, and those exposed to long or repeated shocks by an ECD. Placement of an ECD's darts was also a contributing factor. For any electrical impulse to capture a muscle, it must cross through that muscle. This is why you see defibrillator paddles and pads being placed on either side of the heart when a doctor or a paramedic attempts to externally shock a patient. If a person has the ECD's darts land on their chest, they are at greater risk of having that electricity pass through the heart's muscle. Dr. Zipes states that the question isn't if ECDs can cause cardiac arrest, but how often it happens. As a result of this paper, clinical data, and animal studies, some ECD manufacturers have changed their stance on the non-lethal nature of their products. Law enforcement officials from around the world have taken notice and begun to change their policies on the use of ECDs. For instance, in September of 2012, the Cincinnati Police Department changed its rules mandating frontal shots are prohibited except in situations of self-defense or defense of another. Most who have changed their policies are quick to point out that ECDs protect and save countless lives every day. The numbers of those saved drastically outweigh any risk associated with using the devices. Of course, beyond heart complications on this one, and indeed some of the other non-lethal weapons, it's also noted that some deaths and serious injury occur from otherwise healthy individuals falling and hitting their head or things like that. Again, the exact number of deaths caused by such weapons are hard to discern, as police and military agencies don't tend to make this information public, if they even record it at all. But a 2017 investigation by Reuters found that when it comes to getting zapped, over 1,000 Americans have been killed by the tasers alone since their introduction and widespread adoption by the police in 2000. Amnesty International more or less agrees with the ballpark number. For those advocating for stun guns, it should again be noted that depending on which publication you you read, ECDs are said to have saved around 75,000 lives and reduced the risk of injury to those the devices have been used on by approximately 60%. With many noting the issue is perhaps not the devices themselves, but that occasionally those wielding them treat them a little too cavalierly as non-lethal, something, again, many agencies are rectifying by better training for those given the devices to use. And this, of course, goes with all non-lethal weapons. While not nearly as innocuous as manufacturers occasionally present them as being, they still can be valuable tools when used in specific situations where their use is warranted and the availability of this tool is superior in safety to more extreme tools that would have otherwise needed to be deployed. The controversy, of course, tends to come when they are used in situations where an even lesser tool, perhaps even just de-escalating words, may have been warranted had the individual using the non-lethal weapon properly considered the danger of using said slightly misnamed tool. On the note of terminology, it should come as no surprise that labeling a weapon as non-lethal does not necessarily require the thing to be actually non-lethal. For example, it is the official stance of the United States' Department of Defense that there is no obligation for weapons being classified as being non-lethal to have a zero probability of producing fatalities or permanent injuries, an idea that is reiterated in the official literature of other governments who utilize non-lethal weapons that we consulted. Thankfully, for those of us who are a bit obsessed with semantics, it has become common practice among many agencies to refer to things like rubber bullets and tasers not as non-lethal weapons, but as less than lethal weapons, in acknowledgement of the fact that they can absolutely cause serious injury, though still giving the implication that they won't cause death. On the beach just outside Grantley Adams Airport on the island of Barbados, 5 large naval cannons sit overgrown and rusting in the tropical heat, lying where they were abandoned 50 years ago. These relics are all that remain of Project HARP, an audacious 1960s attempt to launch satellites into space using giant guns, and of the grand ambition of an eccentric Canadian genius whose dreams of outer space would ultimately end in tragedy. The idea of launching objects into space using cannons is as old as modern physics itself. In his groundbreaking 1687 work Principia, Sir Isaac Newton imagined firing a cannonball from a tall mountain at such a great velocity that the curvature of its flight matched that of the Earth, allowing it to circle the planet indefinitely. From this simple thought experiment, Newton was able to link his theory of gravitation to orbital mechanics. In his classic 1865 novel From the Earth to the Moon and its 1870 sequel Around the Moon, French author Jules Verne also used a giant cannon to get his protagonists into space. Indeed, for much of history, guns were considered the only feasible means of space travel, the primitive gunpowder rockets of the time being seen as little more than glorified fireworks. It would not be until the 20th century that the pioneering work of Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, Hermann Oberth, Robert Goddard, Wernher von Braun, and others made rockets the preferred means of reaching out to space. But some still believed guns had a place in space exploration, and none more so than Canadian engineer Dr. Gerald Bull. Bull first became interested in artillery in the 1950s while working at the Canadian Armaments Research and Development Establishment, or CARD. There, he was tasked with designing the outer casing for the Velvet Glove, an air-to-air missile being developed for the Canadian Air Force. While ordinarily this research would be performed using a supersonic wind tunnel, Bull found CARD's tunnel unsuited to his needs and looked for an alternative means of studying the missile's aerodynamics. His solution was an elegant one. CARD had among its facilities a 120-meter-long tunnel for testing artillery shells, the air pressure inside which could be adjusted to simulate different altitudes. Bull made scale models of the Velvet Glove and encased them in wooden sabots to allow them to fit inside a gun barrel. When the gun was fired, the sabot would fall away, leaving the model missile to fly freely down the tunnel. At first, Bull simply hung paper screens at regular intervals along the tunnel to track the flight of the missile, but later he developed special hardened electronics capable of withstanding the extreme acceleration of launch, which could be fitted into the model missiles themselves. These innovations would prove instrumental to Bull's later endeavors. But what truly cemented Bull's interest in big guns was the launch of Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, on October 4, 1957. Fearful of the new threat posed by Soviet ballistic missiles, Bull began thinking up ways of shooting down nuclear warheads. As guided missile technology was not yet advanced enough for this purpose, Bull wondered whether the job could be done using guns. One of his schemes involved developed using what was essentially a giant shotgun to fire a cloud of shrapnel into the upper atmosphere. If an incoming warhead traveling at nearly 20 times the speed of sound touched even a single piece, it would disintegrate. Another scheme involved using a giant gun to fire model warheads to the edge of space so their re-entry could be studied and methods of tracking and destroying them developed. Unfortunately, Bull had what could charitably be called a prickly personality and deep-seated hatred of politicians and bureaucracy, referring to those running Canada's research and defense establishment as cocktail scientists. This attitude increasingly brought him into conflict with his superiors until, in 1961, frustrated by the abrupt cancellation of the Avro Arrow Interceptor and Canada's timid and reluctant attitude towards space research, General Bull quit CARD in disgust. But he was not without allies. During his time at CARD, Bull had made the acquaintance of Lieutenant General Arthur Trudeau and Dr. Charles Murphy of the US Army, who shared his enthusiasm for space exploration and big guns. Shortly after leaving HARP, Bull also accepted a professorship from Dr. Donald Mordell, Dean of Engineering at McGill University. Together, Bull, Trudeau, Murphy, and Mordell began dreaming up a research project that would satisfy each of the men's scientific interests. In March 1962, Bull and Mordell announced the creation of the High Altitude Research Project, or HARP, a collaboration between McGill and the US Army. The stated goal of HARP was to develop the technology to launch small research probes into the upper atmosphere using large guns. This would allow for the collection of data on high-altitude winds and other phenomena for use in weather forecasting at a fraction of the cost of using conventional-sounding rockets. But the project was also about so much more. For Bull and Mordell, HARP was an opportunity to develop low-cost means of launching small satellites into orbit, granting Canada a place among the spacefaring nations. As he later stated, the general attitude towards the research scientist in this country is that he's some sort of parasite. Canadians won't gamble on research unless it's aimed at earning a dollar. I don't see Canada engaging in massive research programs, but I do see us operating in highly imaginative fringe areas, coming out with novel ideas and revolutionary-type thoughts. Meanwhile, the US Army had their own vested interest in the project. In 1958, the US government had essentially banned the Army and Navy from conducting space research, restricting space operations to the Air Force and NASA. Trudeau and Murphy saw HARP as a backdoor means for the Army to maintain a foothold, however small, in the space race. Preparations for HARP proceeded swiftly. From the US Navy, Charles Murphy acquired a pair of 40cm battleship guns which had lain in storage since the 1920s, each 21 meters long and weighing 125 tons. Meanwhile, Mordell secured a test site on the Caribbean island of Barbados. Not only did McGill already operate a weather station on the island and enjoy a friendly relationship with the local government, but the site allowed projectiles to be fired safely out over the Atlantic Ocean. In the summer of 1962, the first gun arrived in Barbados aboard the US Army landing ship USS John D. Page. As the chosen firing site was situated on high cliffs, the gun itself had to be unloaded 2.5 miles away in the largest peacetime over-the-beach landing in US Army history. The gun was transferred to a railway flat car and pushed down the beach on a custom track to the test site, where it was lowered into a pre-built concrete emplacement. Preparations continued for nearly 6 months, work temporarily halting in August due to the Cuban Missile Crisis until, in January 1963, the gun, nicknamed Betsy, was at last ready for testing. On January the 20th, a dummy plywood slug was fired at an angle of 80 degrees, flying 3 kilometers into the air and remaining airborne for nearly a full minute. This was followed the next day by the firing of a real projectile known as a martlet, after the mythical bird on the McGill University crest, which rose to an altitude of 26 kilometers. Project HARP was officially in business. The martlet principle consisted of a steel dart-shaped projectile 1.5 meters long and 12.5 centimeters in diameter, with aluminium fins fitted in a wooden sabot to fit inside the gun barrel. The head of the martlet contains the telemetry electronics, while the main body held a load of either triethyl aluminium, which ignites spontaneously with air, or radar chaff. This was released behind the projectile as it flew, leaving a trail that could be tracked visually or by radar and allow high-altitude winds to be measured. Between 1963 and 1965, more than 100 martlets were fired into the upper atmosphere, generating a body of meteorological data that is still used to this day. But Bull's ambitions were loftier than mere weather forecasting. He wanted to fire a satellite, however small, into orbit. While some doubted the utility of such a system, Bull was optimistic, stating, "We are restricted by the size of the gun. Anything larger than 16 inches in diameter won't get in the barrel. We can't put a space station in space, but once it's there, we can send up the wrench left behind. But even this modest goal presented a massive engineering challenge. According to the laws of orbital mechanics, it is impossible to reach orbit from the Earth's surface using a purely ballistic projectile. Instead, said projectile must be equipped with a small rocket motor and guidance system to reorient and kick itself into orbit. Packing these systems into a martlet and protecting them from high accelerations, all while leaving enough room for a satellite payload, strained the capabilities of 1960s technology, but Bull nonetheless persevered, designing the orbital-capable Martlet 3 and 4 in 1965. Meanwhile, however, the altitude to which martlets could be fired had topped out at around an astonishing 90 kilometers, that's 55 miles. In order to increase this, Bull had a 16-meter tube welded to the end of Betsy, extending the barrel to a whopping 36 meters. This made the gun among the largest artillery pieces ever built and the largest to be fired near the vertical. On July 1st, 1965, the extended gun fired a Martlet 2 to a record altitude of 150 kilometers, that's 93 miles, well above the recognized boundary of outer space. Sadly, however, this was to be Harp's last hurrah. Bull's outspoken disdain for bureaucracy had made him enemies in the Canadian government, many of whom now began finding reasons to shut down the project. As Bull had predicted, most in Ottawa attacked Harp as an unprofitable waste of government funds, with K.F. Tupper of the National Research Council stating, "The Harp project consists merely of large and expensive gadgets that does not open up any new possibilities whatsoever." Others like R.K. Brown from the Ministry of Industry were rather less subtle about their disdain for Bull himself. Although personalities should not affect the decision, they cannot be ignored, and one of the reasons no Canadian government scientists have been closely involved in the control and direction of the project lies in the personality of Dr. Bull, and it need hardly be said that there will continue to be difficulties in this area. Another reason for the government's contempt for Harp was the involvement of the US Army. As US involvement in the Vietnam War continued to escalate, the Canadian government took an increasingly dim view of American militarism and sought to distance itself from efforts like Harp, which it saw as primarily an American project with a Canadian veneer. Furthermore, the Harp launch system competed directly with the new Black Brant-sounding rocket developed by CART. But whatever the reason, by 1967 all government funds had dried up and even the Army had withdrawn its support. Project Harp was officially over. However, having seen the writing on the wall, in 1965 the Army had constructed its own replica of the 36-foot Barbados gun at Yuma Proving Ground in Arizona. On November the 18th, 1966, this gun fired a Martlet 2 projectile to an altitude of 180 kilometers, that's 112 miles, a record that still stands to this day. The life of Gerald Bull after Harp is a subject that could fill an entire episode. But in brief, and pertinent to the topic at hand, using equipment left over from the project, in 1967 Bull established Space Research Corporation, or SRC, a private company specializing in artillery and ammunition design. In the 1980s, Bull's work brought him to the attention of the Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein, who made him an offer he couldn't refuse. In exchange for helping to improve their long-range missiles, they would fund the construction of a giant satellite-launching supergun. The gun, codenamed Project Babylon, would be truly gargantuan, weighing 2,100 tons with a barrel 1 meter wide and 156 meters long, nearly the length of the Washington Monument. But tragically, just like the Martlet satellite, Project Babylon would never come to fruition, for on March the 22nd, 1990, Gerald Bull was gunned down by an unknown assassin outside his apartment in Brussels. But the dream of an orbital gun lived on. Between 1992 and 1995, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory's Project Sharp, super high-altitude research project, developed a series of light gas guns capable of accelerating a projectile to near escape velocity, while in 2005 the Quick Launch Company began development of a 1-kilometer-long gun suspended beneath an offshore oil rig, which would reduce orbital launch costs to only $1,000 a pound. However, the development of SpaceX's reusable Falcon 9 rocket has recently rendered the economics of gun launch significantly less attractive, and it now appears that Gerald Bull's dream will become no more than a fascinating detour on our long road to the stars. And now for some bonus facts. In addition to being the youngest ever PhD graduate from the University of Toronto and the youngest professor at McGill, Gerald Bull held a third, even rarer honor. In 1972, after Space Research Corporation had already been working with the Pentagon for over 5 years, it was realized that as a Canadian citizen, Bull was technically ineligible for top-secret security clearance. To get around this, in October, Senator Barry Goldwater passed a private act of Congress to grant Bull American citizenship. Gerald Bull is only the third person to ever receive this honor after the Marquis de Lafayette and Winston Churchill. And now for another bonus fact. The scientific disdain for rocket propulsion actually carried on well into the 1920s and 30s, the term rocket being associated with pulp science fiction novels and comic books like Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. For this reason, when in 1939 a group of Caltech students founded a small institute for the study of rocket propulsion, they were careful not to use the term rocket in their name, instead coming up with the title that the institute still bears to this day, Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And now for another bonus fact. Despite being written in 1865, Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon was extraordinarily prophetic in its depiction of space travel. Though his chosen method of launch, a giant cannon, would in reality have reduced Verne's astronauts to a thin pink film coating the bottom of the capsule, in other respects, Verne's account is remarkably accurate, the result of the author consulting with multiple astronomers in preparation for writing. In the book, the astronauts travel in a bullet-shaped capsule, which is furnished with an airlock, oxygen recycling system, and even rocket thrusters for maneuvering. Just like the Apollo missions, the capsule is launched from Florida to take advantage of the Earth's rotation, re-enters the atmosphere blunt end first, and splashes down in the Pacific Ocean. Verne even predicts relative weightlessness in space, though he misunderstands the effect as resulting from the Earth and the Moon's gravity cancelling each other out. But perhaps most coincidental of all, the giant cannon that launches Verne's astronaut is called Columbiad, while the command service module that took Apollo 11's crew to the Moon was called Columbia. Bulletproof vests are one of Hollywood's favorite action movie plot devices. Easily concealable and seemingly impervious to all weapons, they provide writers with a handy 11th hour means of saving their characters from certain death. But how can such a relatively thin and flimsy piece of fabric stop a speeding bullet, and are real-life bulletproof vests really as impenetrable as in the movies? Well, lock and load as we dive into the fascinating and dangerous history of ballistic body armor and the incredible modern-day, seemingly otherwise fabric suits that are made to stop bullets. The widespread adoption of practical firearms in the 15th century led to the rapid decline of the use of traditional plate armor. While a medieval suit of armor could protect its wearer against swords, pikes, maces, and other kinds of melee weapons, as well as certain kinds of arrows, all but the heaviest and most expensive suits were mostly useless against a musket ball. Armies thus began to abandon armor in favor of more lightly equipped mobile troops, with certain pieces such as breastplates and helmets being retained by officers and specialized troops like heavy cavalry. For example, during the English Civil War of 1642 to 1651, the Ironside cavalry of parliamentarian or Roundhead leader Oliver Cromwell wore musket-proof breastplates or cuirasses composed of 2 layers of armor. An outer layer that absorbed most of the bullet's energy and an inner layer that prevented it from penetrating. This 2-layer design would later be used in many soft ballistic armor systems. By the 18th century, however, firearms had become powerful enough to penetrate even these defenses, and plate armor was largely relegated to a ceremonial role. For example, the gorget, a piece of armor which originally protected the throat, was shrunk down to a non-functional size and worn on the chest by officers and military policemen as a badge of rank. Ornamental breastplates, often highly polished and decorated, were also worn by officers, aristocrats, and members of elite military units like cuirassiers. Incredibly, this tradition persisted into the 20th century, with French cuirassiers wearing their Napoleonic-era breastplates and helmets into battle during the first weeks of the First World War. But for the most part, plate armor largely disappeared from the battlefield for more than 200 years. The thickness, and consequently the weight of steel plates needed to stop modern firearms projectiles was simply too great to be practical. However, several inventors discovered an unexpected material that proved unusually resistant to gunfire: silk. In Japan, for example, where firearms had been introduced in 1543 by Portuguese traders, armor makers discovered that multiple layers of tightly woven silk quilted together was enough to dissipate the energy of a musket ball and stop it from penetrating. Combined with steel plates, this material was used to construct a new type of armor called bullet tosai gusoku, or bullet-tested. However, these suits were expensive to produce and reserved only for the wealthiest samurai. Following the 1866 French military expedition to Korea, a failed punitive response, Gyeongsun Daewongun, regent of the Great Joseon state, ordered the development of flexible bulletproof armor. The result was the Myonoji Baegab, a vest composed of 30 folds of heavy cotton fabric. These vests were used successfully during the 1871 United States expedition to Korea, triggered by Korean fortresses opening fire on American ships. The surprising protective power of silk was rediscovered by ex-naval surgeon George E. Goodfellow, who made his name treating the gunshot wounds of gunslingers like water in the old west town of Tombstone, Arizona. In 1881, trader Luke Short and gambler Charlie Storms got into an argument and shot at each other with pistols at point-blank range. One .45 caliber revolver bullet penetrated Storms' heart and he quickly died of his wounds. During the autopsy, Goodfellow extracted the bullet, which was wrapped in a handkerchief which had been in Storms' breast pocket. Incredibly, the projectile had not penetrated the silk. After witnessing several similar cases, in 1887, Goodfellow published an article in the Southern California Practitioner titled Impenetrability of Silk to Bullets. He later experimented with an early form of soft body armor resembling the Korean Maonjebe Gab and constructed of 30 folds of silk. However, nothing much came of his invention. But Goodfellow's article would directly inspire the man now recognized as the father of the modern ballistic vest, one Casimir Zeglin. Unusually, given his most famous creation, Zeglin was not a soldier, police officer, or even an engineer or inventor, but rather he was a Catholic priest. That's right, the inventor of soft body armor was literally a man of the cloth. Born in 1869 in Poland, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, at the age of 18, Zeglin joins the Congregation of the Resurrection of Our Lord Jesus Christ, better known as the Resurrectionists, and in 1890 he moved to the United States, settling in Chicago. On October 28, 1893, the recently re-elected mayor of Chicago, Carter Harrison Sr., was assassinated by newspaper distributor Patrick Eugene Prendergast. Having suffered a severe head injury at the age of 4, throughout his life, Prendergast became increasingly disturbed and erratic in his thoughts and behavior. In 1893, he frantically supported Carter Harrison's re-election campaign in the deluded hope that he would be rewarded with a political appointment. When said appointment failed to materialize, Prendergast visited Harrison at his home and shot him 3 times with a .38 caliber revolver. One of the shots penetrated Harrison's heart, killing him instantly. Arrested soon after, Prendergast was found guilty and sentenced to death, being executed by hanging on July 13, 1894. Casimir Zeglin was deeply affected by Harrison's assassination and set about developing a means of protecting future politicians and other individuals from such senseless acts of violence. Drawing directly from George Goodfellow's 1881 article, Zeglin developed a special method for laminating together silk sheets, creating a lightweight protective vest only 1 centimeter thick. On March 16, 1897, Zeglin arranged a live demonstration of his invention before a large crowd, including the mayor and chief of police of Chicago. Apparently, having just as much faith in his sewing abilities as he had in the Almighty, Zeglin donned the vest himself and hired a marksman to shoot him at point-blank range. The crowd gasped as Zeglin crumpled to the ground, but a moment later, he raised his hands and got to his feet, completely unharmed. The crowd then erupted into wild applause. Yet despite this stunning and well-publicized success, Zeglin struggled to find American investors for his invention. Part of the problem was the extreme precision needed to make the vest work. Poorly sewn copycat versions tended to get their wearers killed, and Zeglin lacked the technical knowledge to mass-produce vests to the required level of quality. Undeterred, in December 1897, Zeglin returned to Poland and joined forces with famed inventor Jan Szczepanik. Known as the Polish Edison, or the Leonardo da Vinci of Galicia, Szczepanik had many impressive inventions to his name, including a photoelectrically controlled weaving machine that could cheaply mass-produce colored tapestries and an early form of television known as a telescope. In only a few months, Szczepanik succeeded in perfecting Zeglin's design and creating an automatic line to mass-produce bulletproof vests. There was only one problem. At $800 apiece, that's more than $25,000 today, the vests could only be afforded by the extremely wealthy. It was at this point a disillusioned Zeglin broke off the partnership and returned to America. And while Szczepanik offered to buy his patent for a generous price, Zeglin refused. Nonetheless, Szczepanik, a skilled and well-connected businessman, succeeded in selling the vests to many of the wealthiest and powerful figures in Europe, including Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and King Alfonso XIII of Spain. The vests were also enthusiastically adopted by gangsters in America, especially in Zeglin's adopted hometown of Chicago. The ultimate validation of Zeglin's design came on the 31st of May 1906, during Alfonso's wedding in Madrid, when he and his new bride, Victoria Eugenia of Battenberg, were attacked by Catalan anarchist Mateo Moral. As the wedding procession was returning from the royal monastery of San Geronimo to the royal palace, Moral threw a bomb at the newlyweds' carriage, which killed 30 bystanders and wounded 100 more. However, the fragments failed to penetrate Alfonso's protective silk vest, saving his life. There's a persistent rumor that Szczypiornik sold a vest to Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir apparent to the throne of Austria-Hungary. As the story goes, when Franz and his wife Sophie were assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, the event that ultimately triggered the outbreak of the First World War, his assassin, Bosnian Serb student Gavrilo Princip, suspected that the Archduke was wearing protective armor and opted to aim for his head. However, no concrete evidence has been found to support this claim. It should also be noted here that nobody, not even Emperor Franz Joseph himself, cared about the assassination. In fact, the emperor expressed relief over the killing because it rid him of an heir who he deeply disliked. And more on this and what really started World War I in the bonus facts in just a bit. But in any event, back in America, in March 1901, Casimir Zeglin offered one of his vests to George B. Cortelyou, personal secretary to President William McKinley. For unknown reasons, Cortelyou declined the offer. 2 months later, McKinley was assassinated in Buffalo. Given the relatively low power of the .32 caliber weapon that was used, had McKinley been wearing a vest, he almost certainly would have survived. Sadly, from this point on, Casimir Zeglin all but vanishes from the historical record. Abandoning his bulletproof vest venture, he founded the Zeglin Tire Company and the American Rubber and Fabric Company, which produced tubeless, puncture-resistant tires for bicycles and automobiles. Given that the fate of these companies and Zeglin's eventual date of death has been lost to history, it's safe to assume he was unsuccessful in his endeavors. Meanwhile, Jan Szczypiornik continued to promote Zeglin's bulletproof vest with a series of death-defying live demonstrations, all the while claiming to be the best's sole inventor. Indeed, so successful was this marketing campaign that in Europe it is typically Szczypiornik and not Zeglin who's credited as the father of the bulletproof vest. However, Szczypiornik's success was not to last. Zeglin's design was only effective against relatively low-velocity black powder pistol rounds. With the widespread adoption of more powerful smokeless powder ammunition, within 10 years the vest became useless against all but the weakest handguns. The outbreak of the First World War saw the sudden and unexpected return of plate armor to the battlefield. With the exception of a few special units, like the French cuirassiers, troops marched into battle in 1914 without any kind of protective equipment, not even helmets. The famous spiked pickelhaube worn by German troops were made of boiled leather and designed to deflect sword blows, and they offered no protection against bullets or shell fragments. But as the war bogged down into brutal trench warfare and both sides began mercilessly bombarding the other with artillery shells, the rate of severe head wounds began to soar. In response, all sides introduced not just protective headgear, like the French casque Adrien, the British Brodie helmet, and the German Stahlhelm, but an exotic assortment of metal plate armor, including pieces to protect a soldier's neck, shoulders, and chest. However, most of these devices proved too heavy and bulky to be practical on the battlefield. Those that were adopted, like the German Sapperpanzer or Lobster armor, were mainly issued to static or specialized troops like machine gunners, sentries, or sappers, aka military engineers. Still, such armor was largely designed to protect against shell fragments and could not block anything more powerful than a pistol round. One notable exception was the American Brewster body shield, a breastplate and face protector made of chrome nickel steel which was capable of stopping full power rifle bullets at a few hundred yards. At 18 kilograms, however, it was unwieldy to wear and very few were issued. Interestingly, just prior to the war, the US Army considered adopting a silk ballistic vest similar to Casimir Zeglin's design. However, this idea was abandoned due to the prohibitive cost of silk and the limited usefulness of such soft armor against rifle rounds. During the 1920s and 30s, American gangsters began wearing cheaper ballistic vests made of thick layers of heavy cotton, which were capable of stopping most common pistol rounds with velocities up to 300 meters per second, such as 22 short, 22 long, 25 ACO, 32 ACP, 380 ACP, 38 special, and 45 ACP. In response, police forces were forced to upgrade to more powerful cartridges such as 38 Super and 357 Magnum. This remained the state-of-the-art for soft body armor until 1938, when DuPont chemist William Carruthers discovered the synthetic polymer nylon, which, while not as strong as silk, was stretchier and much cheaper to manufacture. Initially used in toothbrushes and women's stockings, following the outbreak of the Second World War, nylon was pressed into service to make parachutes and flak jackets, among the first pieces of soft body armor to be widely issued in combat. Flak jackets were the brainchild of Colonel Malcolm C. Grow, the Surgeon General of the US 8th Air Force. Grow noticed that the vast majority of wounds suffered by bomber crews operating over occupied Europe were caused by fragments from exploding German anti-aircraft shells, aka flak. And if you're wondering where that word came from, it is an abbreviation for Fliegerabwehrkanone, German for anti-aircraft gun. Convinced that many of these injuries could be prevented by some kind of light protective armor, Grow worked with the British Wilkinson Sword Company to develop a protective vest which in 1943 was officially adopted by the US Army Air Force as the Flyers Vest M1. Weighing in at a whopping 10 kilos, early vests were made of cotton canvas lined with manganese steel plates, while later versions incorporated increasing amounts of lighter ballistic nylon. Several different versions of the flak jacket were also developed throughout the war for different kinds of aircrew, including the Flyer's Apron M3 for waist gunners, the Flyer Apron M4 for ball turret gunners, and Groin Armor M5 for seated crewmen like pilots, co-pilots, navigators, and bombardiers. M1 infantry helmets, modified to fit overflying helmets and headphones, were also widely issued to protect against head injuries. While developed in the UK, flak jackets were rarely used by the Royal Air Force as they were too bulky to wear in cramped British bombers like the Avro Lancaster. However, over 300,000 M1 and 100,000 improved M2 vests were issued to USAAF crews throughout the war. They were also widely worn by US Navy personnel aboard aircraft carriers whose open decks provided little protection against shell and aerial bomb bursts. And while useless against machine gun bullets and cannon shells, flak jackets were effective against shell fragments and helped reduce the number of fatalities from chest and abdominal wounds among USAAF crews by nearly 40%. Meanwhile, much experimentation was done on body armor for use by regular ground forces. In 1940, the British Medical Research Council, or MRC, developed an outfit comprised of 3 plates of 1mm manganese steel, the same as used in British helmets, one covering the chest, the other the lower abdomen and groin, and a third the lower back. These were all held in canvas webbing pouches that could be strapped on over or under a soldier's uniform. Around 5,000 were produced, being mainly issued to British, Polish, and Canadian paratroopers and field medics starting in 1944. However, despite weighing only 1.5 kilos, troops found MRC armor uncomfortable to wear, and it was quickly discarded. Meanwhile, in 1942, the Soviet Red Army introduced an armored vest known as the SN-42 Staalnoy Nagrudnik, or steel breastplate, which comprised 2 plates of 2mm pressed steel covering the torso and groin. Weighing 3.5 kilos, the SN-42 was issued mainly to assault engineers and tank riders, but was capable of deflecting a 9mm pistol or submachine gun bullet at point-blank range. And in 1944, the US Army Ordnance Corps developed an innovative protective vest called the M12, based on a fiber-reinforced resin material called Doron. This material was molded into plates 3mm thick and 130mm square, which were inserted into pockets in a ballistic nylon vest. Far lighter than earlier metal-based armor, the vests were issued in limited numbers during the Okinawa campaign from April to June of 1945 and found to be effective against shell and bond fragments and pistol bullets up to the .45 ACP. After the war, the US Army continued to improve on the M12 design, producing the M1951 vest widely used during the Korean War and the M1955 used in Vietnam. However, as before, these vests were only effective against shell fragments and pistol rounds, while armor capable of stopping more powerful weapons was too heavy for regular combat and was only issued to specialized personnel. For example, in 1967, Natick Laboratories in Massachusetts developed the T65 two-plate carrier vest designed to hold armor plates made up of hard ceramic like boron or silicon carbide or aluminium oxide. Capable of stopping more powerful small arms projectiles like the 7.62 by 39 round fired by AK-style rifles, the 8-kilo T65-2 was issued to pilots of low-flying helicopters during the latter half of the Vietnam War. As in the 1930s, the development of lighter and stronger body armor awaited a breakthrough in materials science. And that breakthrough came in 1965 with the development of polyparaphenylene terephthalate. This is better known as Kevlar. Discovered by DuPont chemist Stephanie Krolek, Kevlar was originally developed as a replacement for steel in belted automobile tires. With a tensile strength of 3,620 megapascals, it is pound for pound 10 times stronger than steel while maintaining excellent flexibility and cut and puncture resistance, making it ideal for ballistic vests. In 1971, Lester Shubin, Director of Science and Technology for the National Institute for Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice, initiated a research program to evaluate the ballistic performance of Kevlar. And if you happen to be an animal lover, you may want to skip this part. These tests involved strapping different thicknesses of Kevlar cloth to anesthetized goats and shooting them with various caliber firearms, all while monitoring blood oxygen levels and other indicators of lung and heart injuries. The program revealed that Kevlar was capable of protecting against most common handgun rounds like .38 Special and 9x19mm at short ranges, preventing the bullet from penetrating and reducing blunt force injuries to less than lethal levels. Indeed, Kevlar ballistic vests were found to increase the wearer's probability of survival by a whopping 95%. The National Institute of Justice published its findings in 1976. However, by this time, Kevlar ballistic vests had already been commercially available for several years, developed by companies such as Smith & Wesson and American Body Armor. Such vests soon became standard equipment for police forces around the world, and according to the International Association of Chiefs of Police, have saved the lives of nearly 3,000 officers annually since 1987.
Like earlier forms of soft body armor, Kevlar ballistic vests work in 2 stages. The outer Kevlar layers absorb the energy from the bullet, causing it to slow down, deform, and spread its energy over a wider area. The inner layers then prevent the bullet from penetrating and help further spread the force of the impact. Indeed, most ballistic vests also incorporate additional pads called trauma pads to further reduce blunt force injuries. However, while a ballistic vest can stop a bullet and save its wearer's life, they may still suffer severe bruising or even broken ribs depending on the type of bullet and the range at which they were shot. Since, by design, the outer Kevlar layers are damaged by bullet impacts, ballistic vests become less and less effective the more hits they absorb and can be defeated by multiple hits to the same area. Kevlar also loses some of its strength when exposed to ultraviolet light, bleach, water, and salt from human sweat, meaning the ballistic layers must be encased in a water and light-proof covering of ordinary nylon. Vests are also typically retired and replaced every 5 years to ensure maximum performance. But while soft body armor can protect against most common handgun rounds, they are still largely useless against rifle bullets, which are significantly more powerful. For example, a typical 9x19mm handgun has a muzzle velocity of 360 meters per second and a muzzle energy of 481 joules. By contrast, the 5.56x45mm NATO cartridge used in many modern assault rifles has a muzzle velocity of 993 meters per second and a muzzle energy of 1,755 joules, nearly 3 times higher. On that note, given that the bulletproof vest Doc Brown wears at the end of Back to the Future appears to be a soft Kevlar type and that the Libyan terrorists were using AK-style rifles, we're going to have to call Hollywood on this iconic scene. Sorry to ruin your childhood, but Doc Brown would be very, very dead. Indeed, the only way to stop full-power rifle bullets is with solid ballistic plates like Small Arms Protective Insert or SAPI used by the United States Armed Forces. Modern ballistic plates are typically made of hard ceramic like aluminium oxide or boron or silicon carbide, often laminated together with polymers like ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene or kraton to form a tough, impact-resistant composite material. These plates are in turn coated with a tough polymer layer to protect the wearer from spalling, the back of the plate flaking off into deadly high-velocity fragments when the front is struck by a projectile, and backed with soft trauma plates to help spread the force of impact. These are then inserted into pockets on a special vest called a plate carrier, which is typically made of ballistic Kevlar fabric for additional protection. There are 2 levels of solid armor commonly manufactured today. Level 3, designed to stop intermediate rounds like 7.62 by 39 and 5.56 by 45, and the full-power 7.62 by 51 NATO cartridge, and level 4, designed to stop more powerful rounds like the 30-06 armor piercing. However, these specifications tend to vary from manufacturer to manufacturer and come with a number of caveats. For example, as with soft armor, solid plates can be defeated by multiple rounds hitting the same area. Also, most plates are designed for use against regular lead-cored bullets, which are easily deformed by the hard ceramic. Bullets with cores made of tungsten, tungsten carbide, or other harder metals are much more likely to penetrate. Finally, plate armor is 5 to 8 times heavier than soft armor on a protected area basis, making it significantly less comfortable and convenient to wear. As in every aspect of life, there are no ideal solutions, only trade-offs. And speaking of trade-offs, this all finally brings us around to how many bullets a piece of armor can absorb before it is rendered useless. Well, as you might imagine, given how many different types of body armor we've been discussing, this depends. As for some general examples, we'll start with soft armor. The moment these are hit by a bullet, the fibers around the area of the impact are compromised and lose some of their ability to absorb and dissipate the energy of a bullet. Thus, if another shot were to hit reasonably close to where the first hit, the bullet has a good chance of penetrating, even if the vest would have normally been able to handle it fine. Thus, while it is possible they can take multiple hits in some cases, and even be rated for such, depending on the caliber of the bullet, the way the armor was made, etc., it's generally deemed unsafe to rely on this. Moving on to ceramic plate armor, in most cases, these plates are designed to shatter when hit by a bullet, dissipating the force of the impact via breaking up the bullet so that the smaller pieces can be absorbed by some backing material like Kevlar or some form of polymer, or, well, sometimes both. However, a side effect of this is that a large portion of the plate is then completely useless against a second shot, similar to our previous example with soft armor. That said, there are types of ceramic armor that are designed to take multiple rounds, just, again, relying on this is generally considered unwise in most cases. And this brings us to polyethylene armor plating. In this case, the impact of the bullet actually melts the plate, which then rehardens, trapping the bullet within it. Due to this, polyethylene armor can survive being shot numerous times without losing its ballistic integrity, and we found examples of manufacturers that claimed their polyethylene armor could take hundreds of rounds before failing. Polyethylene plates also have the advantage of being roughly half the weight of ceramic for the same level of protection. Hybrid body armor is also quite common at higher levels, meaning your mileage may vary from a given piece of body armor to another, with the NIJ's ratings giving a decent overview of what it's capable of, and often the manufacturer's testing giving even more insight into how many rounds of a given type of bullet the vest can take before failure. All this said, again, while a given piece of body armor may pass the tests and even be claimed by the manufacturer to protect against much more, most manufacturers recommend replacing body armor even after a single shot. And beyond that, even in some cases, if you just happen to drop your armor on the floor. This is because, although body armor is designed to stop bullets, some types are surprisingly fragile. For example, ceramic plates can easily crack if dropped. Moving on to soft body armor, stretching or deforming the fibers in some way, again in ways that are sometimes not obvious to the naked eye, also can compromise their integrity. Some manufacturers even advise replacing Kevlar-based body armor if you just get it wet. As previously alluded to, this potentially weakens the fibers. On that note, because daily, otherwise innocuous activities can sometimes compromise body armor, the standard in the body armor industry set by the NIJ is to replace a given vest a maximum of every 5 years, even if it's never been hit by a bullet. Finally, for the fashionably minded individual who might need some protection from getting shot, it turns out bulletproof suits are not just a thing in the movies, but a real product that makes military and police body armor look like something made from an era when hitching up your covered wagon to go to the market was still a thing. Perhaps the most famous manufacturer of these is the Colombian company Miguel Caballero, founded in 1992 by, well, Miguel Caballero. What exact materials he uses to make his line of bulletproof clothing isn't clear, though he states it's a hybrid between nylon and polyester. The advantage of his material is that it is significantly lighter and thinner than Kevlar at equivalent protection levels. And indeed, if you were to go check out their website, their undershirt body armor looks pretty much just like any other undershirt, unless you look really closely. As for the price tag, this isn't listed on the website, but it would appear a basic suit top made by the company will run you upwards of $20,000 to $30,000, though you can get other products such as an undershirt for less, apparently starting at around $4,000. Funnily enough, one of Caballero's favorite ways to advertise is in fact to put the clothing on someone and then personally shoot them, leading to the company's slogan, "I was shot by Miguel Caballero," with apparently a few hundred people shot by the man himself to date. They even have a YouTube channel where you can go and see him shoot his wife in the stomach. Not just stopping bullets, some of Caballero's products are also rated to stop knives, be fireproof, waterproof, etc. Essentially, think of the type of snazzy and robust clothing seen in most spy movies, and that's pretty accurate in this case. And that, dear viewers, is the long and fascinating story of the bulletproof vest. While certainly capable of saving the wearer's life under many circumstances, these devices are hardly the magical device that Hollywood would have us believe. So next time you take a shortcut through the shady part of town or try to buy plutonium from Libyan terrorists, remember, the best way to survive a bullet is not to get shot in the first place. A genius like Doc Brown should have probably known that. Bonus facts. As alluded to, the commonly held notion that World War I was started out of outrage over the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie at the hands of Serbian nationalist secret society known as the Black Hand is not entirely correct. In fact, again, as noted, Emperor Franz Joseph himself expressed relief over the assassination because it rid him of an heir who he didn't like. The emperor commented that God will not be mocked. A higher power had put back the order I couldn't maintain. Indeed, it wasn't just the emperor who was relieved. It was reported by an Austrian newspaper that the general consensus among the various political circles was that the assassination, although a tragedy, was for the best. As far as the Austrian people were concerned, it was noted the event almost failed to make any impression whatever. On Sunday and Monday, the crowds in Vienna listened to music and drank wine as if nothing had happened. Indeed, it took the government itself a full 3 weeks to react. So, why go to war over an assassination if nobody cared? Well, because while nobody seemed to care much about the assassination itself, Austria-Hungary had been looking for an excuse to wage a preventative war against Serbia as a state in order to weaken, destroy them, so as to take back territory in the Balkans, which had been taken during the Balkan Wars. They had not taken it back to this point because they lacked Germany's support. Without that support, they feared Russia too much because of the treaty Russia had with Serbia. With the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and his wife on the 28th of June 1914, Austria-Hungary was able to secure the promise from Germany that it would aid in a war with Serbia and possibly Russia if Russia chose to enter the fray due to their treaty with Serbia. It should be noted here that Austria-Hungary did not really expect Russia to enter the fray, as they expected this to be a very small war that would be over quickly before Russia would be obligated to respond. Now, with Germany's support, if Russia did enter the fray, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia with remarkably severe terms that Serbia would be sure to reject, thus giving Austria-Hungary an excuse to launch launch a limited war on Serbia to reclaim territory in the Balkans. Surprisingly, Serbia responded relatively well to the ultimatum, but they did dispute a few minor clauses which gave Austria-Hungary the excuse they needed to go to war. At this point, the following general series of events happened due to a variety of existing treaties between the various nations, which escalated this minor clash into the First Great War. Russia, bound by their treaty with Serbia, decides to come to Serbia's aid. Germany, with the recent treaty with Austria-Germany, declares war on Russia. France, bound by an existing treaty with Russia, is now at war with Germany by association. Germany then invades Belgium to have easy access to France. Britain, allied to France with an existing treaty, declares war against Germany. This was unexpected by Germany, as they expected Britain to stay out of the war due to the fact that the treaty with France was loosely worded and not entirely binding. However, Britain also had a 75-year-old treaty with Belgium, so because of both of these treaties, they decided to declare war on Germany. With Britain now warring with Germany, Canada, India, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa entered the war as they were colonies of Britain. Japan honours an existing treaty with Britain and declares war on Germany. Austria-Hungary declares war on Japan for declaring war on Germany. The US tries to stay out of the war, but in 1917 decides to enter due to Germany's submarines hindering the United States' commercial shipping because the US was shipping a lot of supplies to the Allies. So in the end, a small quick war over a minor land got turned into a lengthy war that was joined by powers all over the globe due to a variety of existing treaties dating back as much as 75 years before the war started, and as a result, over 20 million people died and 25 or so million more were injured, and endless numbers more had their lives irrevocably altered, not to mention it set the world on the path to the even greater conflict, World War II.
At 10:30 a.m. on February the 14th, 1929, a rattle of gunfire echoed through Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood. 7 men, Irish members of Chicago's North Side gang, had been gunned down in a garage at 2122 North Clark Street by assailants dressed in police uniforms. The Valentine's Day Massacre would go down as one of the most brutal chapters in the city's Prohibition-era gang wars, and though the perpetrators were never definitively identified, suspicion immediately fell on the North Side Gang's greatest rival, the Chicago outfit, headed by legendary mob boss Al Capone. In addition to damaging the reputation of Capone, who until that point had been seen by many as a philanthropist and even a modern-day Robin Hood, the massacre brought notoriety to one of the instruments used in its commission, a weapon which has come to define the Roaring Twenties and remains one of the most recognizable firearms in history. This is the story of the iconic Thompson submachine gun, aka the Tommy gun. In 1884, modern warfare changed forever when American inventor Hiram Maxim patented the first reliable self-loading machine gun. With a rate of fire of 600 rounds per minute, the Maxim gun allowed its operator to deliver an unprecedented volume of fire, especially compared to the single-shot and bolt-action infantry rifles of the era. This firepower allowed various European colonial powers to cut swaths through native populations during the late 19th century scramble for Africa, leading writer Hilaire Belloc to famously quip in his 1898 poem The Modern Traveller, "Whatever happens, we've got the Maxim gun, and they have not." Unfortunately, Maxim's invention proved equally effective against modern armies, as military planners would quickly learn to their dismay as the world marched off to war in August 1914. Along with artillery, the true killer of the Great War, the Maxim and other heavy machine guns helped turn the Western Front into a bloody stalemate of trench warfare in which thousands of men at a time were cut down in futile assaults to capture just a few meters of ground. Almost from the moment the front lines began to stagnate, military planners on all sides began searching for wonder weapons that could help break the deadlock. This search produced a variety of technology still used in warfare today, including tanks, aerial bombardment, and flamethrowers, but a fundamental problem still remained. The average infantryman, armed with only a bolt-action rifle, lacked sufficient firepower to adequately exploit a breakthrough. One proposed solution was the combat shotgun, introduced to the Western Front by the American Expeditionary Force in 1917. Unlike regular combat rifles, pump-action shotguns like the Winchester 1897 or 1912 could easily be maneuvered in the confines of a trench and deliver a withering volume of fire, theoretically allowing an assaulting soldier to jump down into the enemy trench and hose it down within seconds. The American deployment of shotguns famously elicited diplomatic protests from the Imperial German government, who declared their use a war crime and threatened to summarily execute any soldier caught carrying one. The Americans found this rather rich, coming from the nation that had introduced flamethrowers, unrestricted submarine warfare, and chemical warfare, and they called the Germans bluff and threatened reprisals should they ever make good on their threat, and nothing
ever came of the incident. In the end, however, shotguns proved far less effective in combat than anticipated, largely due to problems with ammunition. World War I-era shot shells had paper hulls, which tended to absorb moisture and swell, preventing them from effectively feeding into the shotgun mechanism. For this reason, combat shotguns only saw limited use on the Western Front and had no major impact on the course of the war. Another proposed solution to the individual firepower problem was to arm infantrymen with a faster-firing self-loading rifle. Only one belligerent nation, France, managed to successfully deploy such a weapon, fielding around 86,000 RSC M1917 rifles during the last year of the war. However, this rifle was expensive to produce and unpopular, with the French troops being somewhat unreliable and difficult to maintain under trench warfare conditions. It would not be until the introduction of the American M1 Garand in 1936 that an army would be equipped with a self-loading rifle as its standard infantry weapon. And for more on the evolution of infantry rifles, please do check out our previous video, What Actually Defines an Assault Rifle and Who Invented Them. In the end, most nations elected to produce lighter machine guns that could be carried into combat by a single infantryman, attempts which met with varying degrees of success. For example, the German light machine gun, the MG-0815, was produced by removing a standard MG-08 Maxim gun from its heavy tripod, lightening a few components and fitting it with a shoulder stock, pistol grip, and bipod. Despite these modifications, the 0815 still weighed a whopping 18 kilograms, making it difficult to use and extremely unpopular with the German troops. Indeed, in modern German, the idiom 0815 is still used to describe something unremarkable or uninspired. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the French Shorkat light machine gun, also introduced in 1915, weighed only 9 kilograms. Though it was the most widely produced and deployed automatic weapon of the war, the Shorkat's effectiveness is somewhat hampered by design flaws like its open-sided magazine that tended to accumulate dirt and mud. Perhaps the most effective of the Great War light machine guns was the British Lewis gun, which weighed 13 kilograms and could deliver effective sustained fire from a 97-round Pan magazine. A close runner-up was the American 7-kilogram Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, which, unlike its contemporaries, was designed to be fired from the shoulder or the hip. A contemporary doctrine known as walking fire called for light machine guns like the BAR to be fired from the hip while marching, keeping the enemy's head down as a unit advanced. A special belt with the cup to support the BAR's shoulder stock was even issued for this purpose, though none are known to have been used in combat. But whatever their relative advantages, all of these weapons suffered from the same flaw. They fired full-power rifle cartridges which were heavy to carry, overpowered for the short distances over which combat typically took place, and they made light machine guns difficult to control in fully automatic mode. In the end, it was the Germans who came up with the most practical solution by creating an automatic weapon chambered in a lighter pistol-caliber cartridge, the world's first submachine gun. While the first pistol-caliber automatic weapon to see combat was the Italian Model 1915 Velar Perosa, this was largely used as an aircraft machine gun and squad support weapon and did not fit the modern definition of a submachine gun. First, the Germans attempted to modify existing pistols such as the Mauser C96 and the Luger P08 to fire fully automatically, but these weapons were unsuccessful as their high rates of fire, 1,200 rounds per minute for the Luger, made them uncontrollable and drained their magazines in seconds. It was thus decided to design a suitable weapon from scratch. The result was the Bergmann MP18, designed by pioneering weapons engineers Theodor Bergmann and Hugo Schmeisser. 83 centimeters long and weighing only 4 kilograms, the MP18 was chambered in the 9mm Parabellum cartridge, had a rate of fire of 400 rounds per minute, and was fed from a 32-round drum magazine mounted on the left side of the weapon. Introduced in early 1918, the MP18 was used to great effect by German stormtroopers, specialized groups of elite soldiers who used speed, maneuverability, and advanced light weapons to break through enemy lines and create breaches through which regular troops could then advance. But the weapon was not perfect. The heavy side-mounted drum magazine made it unbalanced and awkward to handle. Later versions would use lighter stick magazines. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another pioneering weapons designer was thinking along similar lines. Brigadier General John Oliver Thompson was a career U.S. Army officer from 1890 to 1914, and he served as director of arsenals for the Army's Ordnance Department. During his tenure, he was responsible for the testing and adoption of the 1903 Springfield rifle and the selection of 45 ACP as the Army's standard pistol cartridge. Disturbed by the deadlocked trench warfare taking place overseas and sensing the United States' impending entry into the Great War, Thompson came up with what he called a trench broom, a portable automatic weapon that would allow troops to quickly clear out enemy defensive positions. With the backing of tobacco magnate and financier Thomas Ryan, in 1916, Thompson formed the Auto Ordnance Company and set about developing two different weapons, an automatic rifle chambered in the Army's standard 306 cartridge and a smaller handheld machine gun chambered in 45 45 ACP. A major design challenge facing Thompson was what kind of delay mechanism to use in his new weapons. All self-loading firearms, that is, those which use the energy from one round to load and fire the next, require some kind of mechanism to delay the opening of the action. Otherwise, hot propellant gas will leak back into the shooter's face, the bullet will exit at a lower velocity, and the bolt will shoot backwards so violently it might damage the firearm. One common solution is to use the recoil of the firearm's barrel or propellant gas tapped off from the barrel to unlock the bolt, but Thompson rejected both designs as too heavy, bulky, and unreliable. Instead, he selected a mechanism based on an unusual physical phenomenon discovered by US Navy Commander John Blyche. While serving aboard the warships USS Niagara and USS Vicksburg, Blyche noted that naval guns with interrupted screw breeches stayed closed when fired with a heavier charge but tended to unscrew when fired with lighter charges. This led Blyche to conclude that dissimilar metals had a higher tendency to stick together when subjected to high pressure, a phenomenon that he dubbed the Blyche effect. The Thompson gun's action exploited this effect using a brass block sliding in an angled channel on the weapon's steel bolt. When the weapon was fired, the rearward pressure exerted by the cartridge caused the brass and steel to stick together, delaying the opening of the bolt. Once the chamber pressure had dropped to safe levels, the brass block slid out of the way and released the bolt, allowing the action to cycle. This initial version of the weapon, dubbed the Persuader or Annihilator, did not have a shoulder stock and was designed to be belt-fed like a heavy machine gun. However, this development went nowhere and the weapon was modified to take conventional box magazines. It was also given the less sensational name Thompson submachine gun. Interestingly, this now universal term was coined by Thompson himself. Previously, such weapons were known by variations of the term machine pistol. Though a few prototype guns had been completed by late 1918. Unfortunately for Thompson, but fortunately for the rest of the world, the Great War suddenly came to an end, dashing auto ordnance's hopes of obtaining large government contracts. Undeterred, Thompson decided to try his luck on the civilian market and in March 1920 contracted the Colt Manufacturing Company of Hartford, Connecticut to produce an initial batch of 15,000 weapons, which was completed in 15 months. As it turned out, these would be both the first and last Thompsons to be manufactured for nearly 2 decades. First released onto the market in 1921, the first model Thompson submachine gun was 86 centimeters long, weighed 5 kilograms, and featured a distinctive ribbed barrel and forward vertical grip. Chambered in 45 ACP, it had a rate of fire of 800 rounds per minute and could feed either from 30-round box magazines or from 50 and 100-round drum magazines. Later versions of the Thompson were fitted with a device called a cuts compensator, which deflected propellant gases upward to prevent the muzzle from rising and making the weapon more uncontrollable in automatic fire. Yet to Thompson's disappointment, his supposedly world-beating weapon failed to find any customers. For year after year, most of the 15,000 Thompson submachine guns lay gathering dust on warehouse shelves, slowly eating away at the Auto Ordnance Company's remaining capital. Part of the problem was timing. With the Great War over, armies around the world were demobilizing, with few purchasing any weapons in quantity, let alone fancy new ones like the Thompson. But the Thompson's main flaw was its cost. The Thompson was a complex design to manufacture, requiring dozens of machining operations, which, in the era before computer-controlled manufacturing, each had to be made using a separate piece of complex machinery. This resulted in a manufacturing cost of $44 per gun, equivalent to nearly $600 today. Auto Ordnance, in turn, sold the guns to distributors for around $150 a piece, while the final retail price was an eye-watering $200. For comparison, the average worker at the time made around 90 cents per hour, while a brand new automobile could be purchased for between $400 to $500. This made the Thompson a difficult investment to justify, particularly with so many other cheaper firearms on the market. Nonetheless, Auto Ordnance embarked on an extensive European marketing tour, searching high and low for anyone to purchase their fancy new guns. Special military versions of the Thompson were proposed, including models chambered in more powerful cartridges and fitted with bipods for use as light machine guns. The German Junkers Aircraft Company even came up with a version of their F-13 transport plane armed with no fewer than 30 downward-firing Thompsons for use as a ground attack platform, because even in the 1920s there was no kill like overkill. But most of these efforts came to nothing, with European militaries showing little interest in the gun. One client Auto Ordnance tried particularly hard to court was the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which at the time was engaged in a bitter struggle against insurgents fighting for Irish independence. But while the RUC was not interested, their rivals, the Irish Republican Army, most definitely were, and purchased and smuggled several hundred Thompson guns into Ireland for use in the Irish Civil War of 1922 to 1923. Back home, the US Air Service and Cavalry tested the gun but rejected
it, while private sales continued at a slow trickle, the main purchasers being banks, police departments, and large corporations, the latter of which found Thompsons particularly useful as, shall we say, labor negotiation tools. Meanwhile, Auto Ordnance's attempts to develop and sell its second product, the Thompson Auto Rifle, were also going poorly. Though the company managed to get the weapon into trials for the US Army's new service rifle, its performance was less than stellar. The bolt recoiled so quickly and ejected spent cartridges so violently that in testing the cases embedded themselves in a wooden block held beside the rifle. The rifle also required lubricated cartridges to operate reliably, ultimately leading to its rejection by the Ordnance Department. Alarmingly, these trials revealed that the heart of the Thompson system, the Bleich lock, did not actually work as designed. Instead, the Bleich effect itself was found to not even exist, meaning that the Thompson sliding brass block did almost nothing to delay the recoil of the bolt. That the submachine gun worked at all was due to the bolt being heavy enough for its sheer inertia to delay its recoil, in reality making the Thompson mechanism a simple, straight blowback action. With the Thompson auto rifle out of contention for the US Army's adoption, Auto Ordnance abandoned the project and turns its attention to its more effective, but still commercially unsuccessful submachine gun. The company's first big break came in 1926 when, following a series of robberies, the US Postal Inspection Service purchased a batch of 200 Thompsons to arm United States Marine Corps troops assigned to guard mail trains. The Marines fell in love with the Thompson and in 1928 ordered another large batch, specially modified to have a slower rate of fire to improve controllability and ammunition consumption. The guns, designated the Model 1928, saw extensive use in Nicaragua, Panama, Honduras, and other countries during the so-called Banana Wars, a series of military interventions in Central America and the Caribbean intended to secure American political and business interests in the region. The Marines later carried Thompsons into China as part of the US policy of gunboat diplomacy. Chinese warlords were impressed by the weapon and many locally manufactured copies were produced. Small numbers of Thompsons were also purchased by the Coast Guard for use against rum runners, while in 1928 the US cavalry, which had previously rejected the Thompson, bought a batch for use by armored car crews. But while this uptick in sales was a welcome development, by 1928 Auto Ordnance had only succeeded in selling 6,000 of its initial batch of 15,000 guns. So at this point you might be asking yourself, but what about the gangsters? Alas, while popular culture would have us believe that every Prohibition-era bootlegger had a trusty Chicago typewriter hidden in his violin case, the reality was considerably less dramatic. As mentioned before, for most people, the Thompson was a prohibitively expensive weapon, so much so that only 10%, that's around 150 guns total, of the initial 1921 batch were ever sold to private individuals. This meant that while several gangs did indeed purchase and use Thompsons, they were nowhere near as prevalent as is commonly believed. But Hollywood has never been one to let the truth get in the way of a good story, and the popular gangster films of the era, such as Scarface, G-Men, and Angels with Dirty Faces, placed the iconic Tommy gun front and center, cementing its mystique as the gun that made the 20s raw. Such media depictions skewed popular perceptions of the prevalence of violent crime, spurring many police departments to purchase their own Thompsons in order to counter this perceived threat. Sales further increased following the 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre and the 1933 Kansas City Massacre, in which a group of gangsters, including Arthur Pretty Boy Floyd, gunned down 4 policemen. The latter incident prompted the FBI to purchase its own batch of 115 Thompsons in 1935. Other gangsters and bandits of the era known to have favored the Thompson include Public Enemy No. 1 John Dillinger, George Machine Gun Kelly, and George Bayface Nelson, who himself met his end in a hail of FBI Thompson bullets on November 28, 1934. The year 1928 was a pivotal one for Auto Ordnance Company, for it was in that year that Brigadier General John Thompson retired and stepped down as head of the company. That same year, the company's main financier and majority stockholder, Thomas Ryan, died at the age of 77. His estate, seeing Auto Ordnance as a money-losing boondoggle, immediately attempted to liquidate the company. The remaining shareholders succeeded, though, in delaying the sale by more than a decade, and they sold most of the company's remaining inventory. But in 1939, Auto Ordnance was finally sold to one Russell McGuire, a notorious corporate raider. Those viewers familiar with 20th century history might recognize 1939 as the year the Second World War broke out, meaning that, much to the chagrin of Thomas Ryan's estate, the previously unsuccessful Auto Ordnance Company was about to experience a major reversal of fortune. With the worldwide demand for firearms suddenly soaring, in December 1939, McGuire signed a contract with the Savage Arms Company of Westfield, Massachusetts, to produce Thompson guns for foreign export. As part of their previous contract with Colt, Auto Ordnance owned all the manufacturing manufacturing tools for the Thompson gun, meaning that by May 1940, the first new batch of guns in nearly 2 decades was already rolling off the production line. The first major purchasers of the new Thompsons were France and Great Britain, who were scrambling to rearm in the face of an imminent Nazi invasion. The latter purchase was particularly ironic, as for decades the British had dismissed the submachine guns as gangster guns with no place in honourable warfare. But with insufficient arms manufacturing capacity at home, Great Britain had no choice but to import hundreds of thousands of American Thompson guns to arm the British Expeditionary Force and Home Guard. Despite its weight, the gun was well liked by British troops, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill was famously photographed shooting one during an inspection of coastal defences. Propagandists on both sides had a field day with this photo op, with Allied propaganda emphasising Churchill's status as a fighting leader, while Nazi propaganda painted him as a dangerous gangster. In the end, however, a combination of limited cash reserves and the loss of thousands of weapons on the beaches of Dunkirk meant that the British were never able to acquire enough Thompsons and were forced to turn to a much cheaper and cruder alternative to make up the shortfall, the much maligned plumber's nightmare, the Sten gun. And for more on this, please check out our previous video, the pivotal World War II gun that nobody wanted to put down. Meanwhile, in December 1941, the United States entered the war, further driving up demand for Thompsons. However, the original 1921 and 1928 models were far too expensive for mass adoption, forcing Auto Ordnance to make a series of cost-saving modifications. The rear sight was greatly simplified, the ribbed barrel smoothed down, the iconic vertical grip replaced with a simpler horizontal version, and the cuts compensator eliminated, creating the model 1928A1 with a final purchase price of only $70. Around 1 million of the 1928 A1s were produced between January and June 1942, when production switched to the even simpler and cheaper M1 variant. The M1 did away with the previous version's complex and useless blish lock, allowing the receiver and bolt to be greatly simplified and the bolt handle to be moved from the top to the side of the weapon. Barely 4 months into the first production run, the M1 itself was replaced by the even simpler M1A1, whose design cut 10 hours off the production of each gun and dropped the government purchase price down to $43 per unit. The M1A1 would go on to become the iconic American submachine gun of World War II, with nearly 1.3 million being manufactured by Savage, as well as Auto Ordnance in its own factory in Bridgeport, Connecticut. But even in its cheapest, most simplified form, the Thompson was still too complex and expensive to keep up with the insatiable demands of the US war machine, so in 1942 the US Army Ordnance Board took a page from the British and began developing a new submachine gun that could be produced far more cheaply and in greater numbers than the Thompson. The resulting weapon, designed by engineers George Hyde and Frederick Sampson of General Motors Inland Division, was, like the British Sten gun, built mainly of welded steel stampings, bringing its manufacturing cost down to only $20.94, less than half of the M1A1 Thompson. Furthermore, its manufacture did not require specialized machine tools, allowing the gun to be produced in a wide variety of factories. Indeed, most of the guns produced during the war were manufactured by GM's Guide Lamp division, which had previously made car headlamps. Formally adopted in December 1942, the new weapon was officially designated the M3 submachine gun, though due to its resemblance to a certain mechanic's tool, it was universally known to the troops as the grease gun. Though the grease gun was intended to replace the Thompson, problems with tooling up the M3 production line meant that the production of the M1A1 Thompson continued until February 1944, with the gun continuing to serve until the end of the war. While the M3 was cruder and slightly less accurate than the Thompson, it was nonetheless an effective weapon and was well liked by US soldiers. 655,000 were produced before the war ended, and while the M3 was officially dropped as a standard service weapon in 1957, a handful remained in service as personal defense weapons for tank crews until as late as 1992. As for the Thompson, the end of World War II brought its 20 years of military service to a close. While certainly an iconic weapon, the Thompson was a design from an earlier era whose complex and expensive manufacturing process made it ill-suited to the modern era of industrialized warfare. Yet its legend lives on in movies, TV shows, and other pieces of popular media, where the Chicago typewriter in the hands of fictional gangsters and lawmen continues to make the 1920s roar. Space, the final frontier, or if science fiction is to be believed, the final battlefield. In the lands of sci-fi, no self-respecting Starfleet officer on an away mission or scruffy-looking nerve-herding smuggler would dare leave their spacecraft without a trusty phaser or blaster at their side. Even in universes where directed energy weapons have not yet been invented, such as those of Firefly, Battlestar Galactica, and Alien, everyone, it seems, is armed to the teeth with a variety of pistols, rifles, shotguns, and machine guns. But that is fiction. What about real life? Has anyone ever blasted into the wild blue yonder packing heat? As it turns out, yeah! though not for the reasons that you might think. Though today space travel is associated with peaceful exploration and scientific research, in the early days, the conquest of outer space was a decidedly military affair, with the space race serving as a more peaceful proxy to the Cold War smoldering on the surface. The Soviet R-7 rocket that launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, on October 4th, 1957, was also the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile designed to carry a nuclear warhead from the Soviet Union to the United States. Indeed, most of the United States' early space rockets, such as the Redstone and the Atlas, were modified nuclear missiles, while no sooner had the space race begun than both sides set out to militarize the final frontier. In 1958, for example, the United States Air Force authorized Project A-119, a top-secret project to detonate a nuclear warhead on the surface of the moon. Yes, really. The project, which included among its research team a young Carl Sagan, was justified as a scientific experiment to study lunar geology. Its main aim, however, was to intimidate the Soviets and boost the morale of the American people in the wake of the Sputnik crisis. While A-119 and its Soviet equivalent, Project E-4, were never carried out, between 1958 and 1962, both superpowers set off a series of 22 nuclear explosions in space and the upper atmosphere as part of research into anti-ballistic missile systems, and for more on these tests and their unexpected effects, please check out our previous video, The Time the US Accidentally Nuked Britain's First Satellite, and do real EMP weapons exist, or are they only a thing in movies? Throughout the early Cold War, the drawing boards of both American and Soviet designers overflowed with increasingly fanciful designs for orbital weapons platforms, nuclear-armed spaceplanes, and lunar military bases. But the potential escalation of the Cold War into outer space made many back on Earth extremely nervous, and on January the 27th, 1967, the Soviet Union, United States, and United Kingdom signed the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, better known by the shorter and easier to remember Outer Space Treaty. Among other provisions, the treaty declared space to be open and free for peaceful exploration by all states, prohibited states from claiming sovereign territory or building military installations on the Moon and other celestial bodies, and banned the stationing of weapons of mass destruction in space. While the United States and most other spacefaring nations have so far largely adhered to the terms of the treaty, the Soviet Union and later the Russian Federation have been, shall we say, rather more relaxed in their interpretation, and cosmonauts regularly carry firearms into orbit. But these weapons were not, however, intended for use against waves of attacking US Space Marines, but for a far more practical purpose, inspired by one particularly eventful space mission. On March the 18th, 1965, 30-year-old cosmonaut Alexei Leonov made history by becoming the first human to perform an extravehicular activity, or spacewalk, floating outside his Voskhod 2 spacecraft for 12 minutes. His triumph, however, was short-lived, for almost immediately, his mission began to go horribly wrong. When Leonov tried to crawl back through the capsule's inflatable airlock, he discovered that his spacesuit had ballooned in the vacuum of space, and he could no longer fit through the hatch. After several minutes of fruitless struggling, Leonov, knowing full well that his pilot Pavel Belyev's orders, should he fail to return, were to cut him and the airlock free, proceeded to bleed air from his suit, risking decompression sickness, aka the bends, in the process. In the end, Leonov managed to get back aboard the spacecraft, but he and Belyev's problems were far from over. As the cosmonauts prepared for re-entry, their automatic guidance system failed, forcing them to switch to manual override. The equipment module then failed to fully separate from the orbital module, causing the spacecraft to tumble violently end over end as it plunged through the atmosphere. Finally, at an altitude of 100 kilometers, the cables connecting the two modules burned through, and the remainder of the re-entry and parachute deployment proceeded uneventfully. However, the failure of the automatic guidance system resulted in the spacecraft overshooting its intended landing site by nearly 400 kilometers and touching down in the remote, heavily forested Perm region of the Ural Mountains. Upon landing, the capsule's hatch automatically blew off, exposing the cosmonauts, who had not been provided with winter clothing, to extremely cold temperatures. And as if to add insult to injury, the cabin heater failed while the cooling fans remained jammed on, blasting Leonov and Belyaev with cold air through the night. Even worse, the Siberian forests the cosmonauts knew were crawling with dangerous predators, including wolves, Eurasian brown bears, and even Siberian tigers, which were made even more aggressive by the advent of mating season. The capsule
capsule survival kit did include a Makarov PM semi-automatic pistol for foraging and defense against predators, but its rather anemic 9x18mm cartridge would have been next to useless against an angry bear or tiger. Thankfully, Leonov and Belyaev encountered no local wildlife, and the next morning their capsule was spotted by a search and rescue helicopter. However, the landing site was too densely forested for the helicopter to land, so the crew instead dropped warm clothing, water, food, and other supplies for the cosmonauts before landing a team of ski-equipped rescue troops in a clearing 9 kilometers away. With the help of their new supplies, Leonov and Belyaev built a crude log cabin and a fire and sat tight awaiting rescue. Finally, after 3 nights in the Siberian wilderness, they were reached by the recovery forces and skied the 9 kilometers back to the helicopter landing site, from where they were all flown to Perm and finally to Moscow. Though Leonov and Belyaev, both experienced hunters and outdoorsmen, were never in any real danger, nonetheless prompted Leonov to request a more powerful and versatile survival weapon be developed for future space missions. The result was the TP-82 Cosmonaut Survival Pistol, designed in 1981 by Igor Alexandrovich Skrylev of the Tula Arms Plant. 36 centimeters long and weighing only 2.4 kilograms, the TP-82 features not one barrel but 3 2-smoothbore shotgun barrels chambered in the proprietary 12.5 by 70mm shell, roughly equivalent to 40 gauge, and a lower rifle-barreled chamber for the same 5.45 by 39mm cartridge as the Soviet military standard issue AK-74 rifle. And for more on how the confusing gauge measurement system works, please check out our previous video, What's Up with Measuring So Many Things in Gauge. The single-shot weapon, which is reloaded by tipping the barrels forward like a regular break-action sporting shotgun, has 2 external hammers. The one on the right fires the right-hand shotgun barrel, while the one on the left can be switched to fire either the left-hand shotgun barrel or the lower rifle barrel. For more accurate shooting, the weapon is provided with a detachable shoulder stock that doubles as a machete for clearing brush or chopping firewood. Stored in a special survival kit compartment beneath the crew couches of the Soyuz spacecraft, the TP-82 is issued with a special Granite 6 canvas belt incorporating holsters for the weapon and its machete stock and ammunition pouches, which hold 10 shotgun shells loaded with birdshot, 10 flares for signaling rescue aircraft, and 11 rounds of 5.45 rifle ammunition. Unlike military ammunition, however, the TP-82 rifle cartridges feature expanding soft-point bullets for maximum effect against large predators. Such bullets have been illegal for use in warfare since the signing of the Hague Convention of 1899. In testing, the TP-82 proved remarkably rugged and accurate, with the final evaluation stating the weapon underwent comprehensive tests in different climatic zones of the countries, which confirmed its high reliability and effectiveness under extreme conditions. In testing, the weapon was fired at a variety of animals and birds. Using the rifle barrel, evaluators successfully brought down moose, wolverines, loitered gazelles, saiga, and foxes with body weights up to 200 kilograms from distances of up to 200 meters. Using the shotgun barrels, they took down hares, foxes, geese, partridges, doves, pheasants, and seagulls. In parallel with the TP-82, Tula also developed the more advanced TOZ-81 Mars pistol. Unlike the single-shot TP-82, the TOZ-81 was a double-action revolver with a 5-shot cylinder. 2 versions were designed, one with a rifle-barrel chamber for the 5.45 by 39mm cartridge, and one with a smoothbore barrel for a 410-bore shotgun shell filled with buckshot or dart-like flechettes. A true Swiss Army knife of a gun, the TOZ-81 featured a flip-out survival knife mounted above the barrel and a compact radio transmitter built into its detachable aluminium shoulder stock. In the end, however, the rugged simplicity of the TP-82 won out over the more complex TOZ-81, and in 1982 the former was officially adopted as part of the Soyuz survival kit, first flying into space aboard the Soyuz T-6 mission on June the 24th of that year. The total number of TP-82s manufactured is not known, but production at Tula ceased around 1987 once enough guns and ammunition had been made to last the space program and the Soviet Air Force several decades. In keeping with the infamously secretive nature of the Soviet space program, for many years the TP-82 remained something of an open secret, the weapon rarely glimpsed by Western eyes. But as more and more Western astronauts began flying aboard Russian Soyuz spacecraft, the unique Cosmonaut pistol came to be more widely known. Training on the TP-82 is considered the highlight of the standard cosmonaut survival course carried out on the shores of the Black Sea. After learning how to safely exit a capsule which has landed in water, trainees are invited to fire a few shots off the deck of the training vessel. As US astronaut James Voss recalled, "It was amazing how many wine, beer, and vodka bottles the crew of the ship could come up with for us to shoot at. The TP-82 was very accurate. We threw the bottles as far as possible, probably 20 or 30 meters, and then shot them. It was trivial to hit the bottles with the shotgun shells and relatively easy to hit them with the rifle bullets on the first shot."
Yet despite the very practical reasons for the TP-82's creation and adoption, the idea of cosmonauts carrying guns into space makes some people more than a little nervous. Among these is American journalist James Oberg, who for decades has doggedly lobbied to have all firearms removed from Russian space missions. But while we might think of astronauts as morally upright, hyper-competent, steely-eyed missilemen, in the end, Oberg argues they are merely humans with very human feelings. For example, in February 2007, NASA astronaut Lisa Nowak was arrested after attempting to kidnap Colleen Shipman, the lover of her husband, fellow astronaut William Oefelein. Wearing adult diapers to avoid making stops, Nowak drove over 1,400 kilometers from Houston, Texas to Orlando, Florida, where she tracked Shipman down to the Orlando airport parking lot and pepper sprayed her through her open car window. Nowak later pled guilty to felony burglary and misdemeanor battery and was sentenced to 1 year's probation, while she and Oefelein became the first astronauts to ever be dismissed from NASA. That same year, on April the 20th, 60-year-old engineer William Phillips smuggled a revolver into the Johnson Space Flight Center in Houston and used it to kill electronics specialist David Beverly. Phillips then held contract worker Fran Crenshaw hostage and after a tense 3-hour standoff with police turned the gun on himself. A later investigation determined that Phillips was likely motivated by fears of being fired due to poor work performance. Given the potential for even highly trained spaceflight personnel to suffer severe mental breakdowns, the presence of readily available firearms aboard the Soyuz and International Space Station is, James Oberg argues, a disaster waiting to happen. He has thus tirelessly lobbied Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, to implement stricter security measures such as storing survival weapons in a locked compartment with a key controlled by the capsule commander, or even better, in an exterior compartment accessible only once the capsule has safely returned to Earth. Oberg has even questioned the necessity of carrying weapons in the first place, as vastly improved spacecraft tracking and recovery procedures have rendered a Voskhod 2-style recovery scenario highly unlikely. Thankfully, whether due to Oberg's efforts or not, significant progress has been made in the area. In 2006, Roscosmos announced that the TP-82 survival pistol had been retired, stocks of its proprietary 12.5 by 70mm shotgun shells having become unusable due to age. It was replaced in the Soyuz survival kit by a regular semi-automatic pistol, most likely the standard Russian issue MP443 Grach. But even this, it turns out, is not always carried into orbit. Just prior to a record-breaking 199-day stay aboard the International Space Station, Italian astronaut Samantha Cusa-Ferretti approached James Oberg with what she called a really good story about the gun. During training at Yuri Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center outside of Moscow, better known as Star City, Cusa-Ferretti and her fellow trainees were asked to list the contents of the standard Soyuz survival kit. Quote, "Then to show off I knew even more, I added that a pistol had once been on this list, but had recently been removed. After congratulating me on a perfect score, the instructor corrected me. The pistol is still on the official list of kit contents, but before every mission, we meet to review that list and vote to remove it for this specific flight." Thus, the odds of a gunfight breaking out aboard the International Space Station are, for now at least, mercifully low. Should a dispute between astronauts ever reach the point of physical violence, their only recourse will be good old-fashioned fisticuffs. Captain Kirk would be proud. But the story doesn't quite end there. For while TP-82s, Makarovs, and other pistols carried by cosmonauts were never intended for use in orbit, another much larger Soviet weapon most definitely was and holds the distinction of being the only gun ever fired in space. In the late 1960s, the United States Air Force began work on a project known as Manned Orbiting Laboratory, or MOL, a manned space station based on NASA's Gemini space capsule. Manned by 2 astronauts and traveling in a polar orbit, MOL would be equipped with powerful surveillance cameras, allowing it to take detailed photographs of Soviet military installations and other targets. When the Soviets learned of MOL, they immediately began developing their own reconnaissance space stations, codenamed Almaz or Diamond. To conceal the military nature of the project, the Almaz stations were flown under the cover of the civilian Salyut space station project. The first Almaz station, designated Ops-1 or Salyut-2, was launched on April 3, 1973. 3 days after reaching orbit, however, one of the fuel tanks of the Proton rocket that launched Salyut-2 exploded, showering the station with debris and leaving it severely damaged and unusable. The station re-entered the atmosphere and burned up on May 28th, having never been visited by any crews. The next Almaz station to be launched was Salyut-3 on June 25th, 1974. In addition to powerful surveillance cameras and radars and signals intelligence gear, Salyut-3 carried a nasty surprise. A Nudibun Richter R-23M automatic cannon. Developed in 1959 by the KB Tokmak Design Bureau as a radar-guided defensive weapon for the Tupolev Tu-22 blinded jet bomber, the R-23M could fire specialized 23mm shells at a rate of 950 to 5,000 rounds per minute, allowing Salyut-3 to engage and destroy targets up to 2 kilometers away. The cannon, intended for self-defense against American spacecraft seeking to inspect, board, or destroy the station, was mounted rigidly to Salyut-3's hull, meaning the entire
20-ton station had to be reoriented in order to aim the gun. Maneuvering thrusters were used to counter the recoil of the weapon and prevent the station from drifting during firing. Salyut 3's cannon was test-fired for the first and only time on January 24, 1975. Though the weapon was eventually intended to be operated by the station's crew, concerns over excessive noise and vibration led to the test being conducted after the last crew had departed, the station gun being controlled remotely from the ground. While the results of the test are still classified, unconfirmed reports indicate that it was a success, with the gun firing 3 short bursts, expending a total of 20 rounds and successfully destroying a target satellite. Sadly, any existing footage of the test was lost when the station deorbited and burned up mere hours later. The third and final Almaz station to be launched, Salyut 5, dispensed with the gun, though the planned but never flown Ops 4 station was to have carried a pair of interceptor missiles instead. By this time, however, the concept of manned reconnaissance space stations had fallen out of favor, unmanned spy satellites being capable of performing the same mission far more cheaply and efficiently. Consequently, in 1978, the Almaz program, like the MOL project, which first inspired it, was declared obsolete and cancelled. The cannon aboard Salyut 3 remains the only offensive weapon known to have been deliberately tested in space, though this was not for lack of trying. Though the 1967 Outer Space Treaty expressly forbids the stationing of weapons in orbit, treaties, as history has shown us, are made to be broken, and throughout the late 20th century, both the United States and Soviet Union carried right along trying to militarize the final frontier. The most famous of these attempts was the American Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as Star Wars, a proposed system of orbital and ground-based lasers, interceptor missiles, and other weapons designed to shoot down Soviet ballistic missiles and render the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal useless. But while many components of the system were tested throughout the 1980s, no operational weapons ever reached orbit. Similarly, on May 15, 1987, the Soviets attempted to launch Polyus, an orbital weapons platform with a megawatt-power carbon dioxide laser designed to shoot down incoming ballistic missile warheads. However, a programming error caused the spacecraft to become misaligned during launch, and it never reached orbit. Since then, the United States, Russia, France, and other countries have announced various designs for orbital weapons designed to disable or destroy enemy warheads or satellites, but so far as is known, none of these have ever left the drawing board, and let's hope it remains that way. And now, one final note before we end the video, since by now most of you are probably wondering, yes, regular firearms will indeed work in space. The propellant powder in firearms cartridges contains its own source of oxygen, meaning that it will ignite and burn even in a total vacuum. The rest of a typical firearms mechanism is similarly space-proof, with one major exception: grease and lubricating oil, which may evaporate, congeal, or otherwise stop working properly in the vacuum of space. This is, however, easily mitigated through the use of specialized lubricants designed for use in space, or in a pinch, by dispensing with lubricants entirely. Indeed, this was the solution favored by German troops fighting on the Russian front during the Second World War, when freezing temperatures caused ordinary lubricating oils to congeal and guns to jam. In desperation, German armorers soaked soldiers' weapons in gasoline to remove all traces of oil. While these unlubricated weapons wore out quickly, under the circumstances, they were better than nothing. Another potential issue with using regular firearms in space is the dark finish on the metal, which will readily absorb the intense solar radiation, causing the weapon to overheat and ammunition to prematurely ignite or cook off. However, this too is easily mitigated through the use of reflective white or metallic coatings, meaning the absurdly shiny ray guns in old sci-fi movies served a practical purpose after all. But perhaps the greatest challenge to using guns in space is Newton's third law, for unless a wannabe space cowboy is firmly anchored to the hull of a spacecraft or equipped with maneuvering thrusters in a microgravity environment, the recoil from even a regular handgun is enough to send them drifting and tumbling uncontrollably. Perhaps this is for the best. After all, we have enough violence and warfare down here on Earth, so let's leave our weapons on the launch pad, shall we?
In the video today, we're answering a viewer question because Philip G asks us, what's the best way to fire 2 guns at once? Alright, Philip, what are you planning? Jesus. And just before we get into that, thanks to Cuisine Royale for sponsoring this video, a multiplayer last man standing online shooter, which is free to play. Maybe you're already a pro at dual wielding and you're thinking, Simon, I know what I'm doing. Well, in that case, put yourself to the test with Cuisine Royale. It's a last man standing style game where basically you arrive on a map, you search out a whole bunch of stuff to kill people with, and then you proceed to kill them or be killed. We can't all be winners, can we? It's a lot of fun, realistic, with, normal guns and stuff that you'd expect from a game like this, but it's also pretty intensely crazy. There's different characters you can play with who have special abilities like bullet time, cloaking, or the power of the Norse gods. Yes, really, but that's just the start. Discover teleportation, work out how to summon zombies, use a jetpack, set some traps. Yes, this game, you might have guessed, is pretty insane. And these are all things that are there just to serve you so you can be the last person standing. Oh, and best of all, this game is totally free. It's easy to access. PC, Xbox One, PS4. Just download it and get started. It's a lot of fun for a cost of $0. So give it a try, register below, and let's get into today's video. If you've ever seen pretty much any action movie involving a badass spy or member of law enforcement, you know a common trope in the industry is to have the protagonist firing away at the bad guys with a gun in both hands. But is this ever actually done in real life? And if so, what's considered the proper method for such badass looking weapon wielding? To begin with, there are indeed many accounts of people in history wielding two guns at once as a fighting tactic, despite it being decried by basically every firearms expert on the planet today. In fact, historically, matchlock pistols, among others, were often built and sold in pairs, with some even being specifically designed to be held in either the left or the right hand. As you might have guessed from this, there was a time when dual wielding was an excellent tactic to use, and in more modern times, there is even one group of soldiers who seem to have used it in actual combat and outline the most effective way to do it, which we'll get into shortly. First, going back to the early days of handguns, these weapons could only be fired once and then needed to be reloaded, which was a rather time-consuming process. They also often had a tendency to not fire at all. Thus, choosing to hold two of the guns at the same time allowed you to increase the odds of getting at least one shot off, and in the best case, allowed two shots without needing to take the time to draw a second weapon or reload. Not just for firing at multiple targets, this was a much better tactic for firing at one, as these guns were also notorious for their inaccuracy, even at relatively close range. Thus, firing two inaccurate weapons at a single target, potentially at more or less the same time, actually significantly increased your chance of hitting it. As for documented accounts of people dual-wielding historically, we have many. For example, many pirates seem to not just have resorted to dual-wielding for this purpose, but also often carried many more guns on their person when attacking or being attacked, allowing for potentially multiple rounds of dual wielding. For example, notorious pirate Edward Teach, aka Blackbeard, seems to have carried as many pistols as he could comfortably put on his person during attacks, allegedly upwards of 6 to 12 at a time. Moving on to the late 18th century, we have this account from a June 16, 1772 letter recounting the attack on the HMS Gaspee. Duddingston, with his two pistols in his hands, jumped up upon deck, went forward, and hailed them. They answered they wanted him, and by God, they would have him dead or alive. He ordered them to keep off their peril. They continued to advance, and he fired his pistols amongst them, which hurt nobody. They returned the fire immediately, shot the captain in the arm, and wounded him in the body, of which it's thought he will die. Another account of dual wielding can be found in a report of the exploits of lawman Bat Masterson, as accounted by one Dr. W.S. Cockrell. W.B. Masterson shot 7 men dead within a few minutes. While in a frontier town, news was brought to him that his brother had been killed by a squad of ruffians just across the street. Taking a revolver in each hand, for he shoots readily with both of them, in this manner, Dr. Cockrell demonstrated this by crossing his wrists to form an X, he ran over to avenge his brother. The murderers became terror-stricken when they saw him coming and hastily locked the door. Masterson jumped square against the door with both feet, bursting it open at the first attempt. Then he sprang inside, firing immediately right and left. 4 dropped dead in a shorter time than it requires to tell it. Perhaps the most famous case of dual wielding of all is that of Gold Rush prospector and Army veteran Captain Jonathan Davis. On December the 19th, 1854, Davis and his 2 companions, James McDonald and Dr. Bolivar Sparks, were walking on a trail in El Dorado County, California, when they were ambushed by a large band of outlaws. Said outlaws subsequently downed the good doctor and McDonald, leaving Davis to face 11 bandits alone. Given the number of attackers firing at him simultaneously, he pulled out both of his Colt revolvers at once, stood his ground, and emptied them. When the guns were spent on both sides, there were 4 remaining bandits, meaning Davis had managed to down 7 moving targets with 12 total rounds. 3 of the remaining attackers then drew their bowie knives, and 1 reportedly a sword. Davis, who was noted as being an extremely good fencer, drew his own bowie knife, managing to kill the first, disarm the second, lopping off one of his fingers and the guy's nose in the process, and then dispatched the remaining 2. When the dust settled, 7 of the bandits were dead, and the remaining 4 were would later die of their wounds. MacDonald was also dead, but Dr. Sparks was still alive at this point, though he later died of his wounds. As for Davis, he suffered only a few holes in his clothes and some minor flesh wounds from the shots that had barely missed. If you're thinking, maybe, given that Davis is the only one who survived, he may have embellished his actions, it's noted that beyond the doctor living for a bit after to recount what happened, a group of miners nearby witnessed the firefight and would later corroborate Davis's story. Of course, it should be noted that it does seem in the vast majority of cases at this point in history, most people had switched to favouring single wielding of their firearms for the simple reason that they were now using relatively reliable and accurate firearms that could hold multiple rounds, and in most cases, you weren't finding yourself out in the open under the attack of far more assailants than a single pistol could handle. Further, while there is a bit of a time penalty in drawing a second weapon later in single-wielded firing, some people are exceptionally fast at it. For example, consider this account of Wild Bill Hickok. He shot 6 times so quick it startled me, for his 6 was in his holster. When I said draw, I was looking directly at him and only saw a motion and he was firing. No use to ask how he drew, I don't know. I only saw his arm was not straight and stiff. There was a perceptible curve to his arm, but very slight. Every shot was in the paper and 2 in the spot, but all of them within 1 inch of an up and down line like this. And speaking of ambidextrous shooting, while Hickok apparently did not typically dual wield, as it was almost never necessary at this point, he was apparently prodigiously skilled at ambidextrous shooting, with the account going on. We put up another paper, and Bill tried his left hand, with the result that all were in the paper, but none in the spot, but all of them on the up and down line, 6 inch. Each almost over the other or in the same hole. I said, not quite so good, Bill. He said, I never shot a man with my left hand, except the time when some drunken soldiers had me down on the floor and were trampling me, and then I used both hands. And just as a pro tip for those wanting a big target but slightly lower chance of death than aiming higher up, especially in more modern times with antibiotics and medical facilities and expertise, in this account, Hickok also states, Charlie, I hope you never have to shoot any man, but if you do, shoot him in the guts near the navel. You may not make a fatal shot, but he will get a shock that will paralyze his brain and arm so much that the fight is all over. Of course, modern guns are typically exceptionally accurate, and some hold an amazing number of bullets, further skewing firearms experts against the practice of dual wielding, especially as depicted by Hollywood, where they often fire at multiple targets at once. This is a pretty surefire way for most not to hit anything, though a select few can pull it off. Exhibit A. A man considered by many to be the greatest shooter of all time, competitive shooter, and many world record holder, Jerry Miculek, who has a video you can go watch of him firing 2 guns at random targets popping up from about 7 meters away. He also did the same thing with just 1 gun for comparison. The results? In the single weapon test, out of 26 shots, 24 found their marks on the randomly popping out targets. In the dual wielding test, 48 of the 52 shots found their mark, meaning he attains the same 92.3% accuracy on both tests, but with one he had twice as many bullets to work with. However, beyond of course being one of the greatest gun wielders in history, it's noteworthy here that he was standing completely still, unlike what is often depicted in movies with the characters running, jumping, flipping, and firing all at the same time. Further, Miculek was only firing 1 weapon at a time and explicitly noted the extreme difficulty in doing it this way versus single weapon firing, even though in the end his success rate of hitting the targets was the same in both tests. And if you're curious, well, timing wasn't an explicit thing being measured here, with the random popping out timing particularly potentially affecting results. For what it's worth, we measured and the single gun fire took 36 seconds, or 1.38 seconds per shot, and the dual firing took 1 minute and 16 seconds, or a rate of about 1.46 seconds per shot, which is actually slower. But again, Miculek wasn't trying for speed here, and the timing of the pop-outs wasn't being regulated between the 2 tests. Rather, each test finished when he'd emptied the guns, with, in the case of dual firing, a couple instances of him not able to focus and fire at all before a target popped out and then disappeared. It would be interesting to see him rerun the demonstration, but specifically designing a test to see if he could be faster at hitting random targets with 2 guns compared to 1, or if his ability to adjust targeting with 1 gun is actually faster than his ability to refocus back and forth between weapons, as may be the case from this demonstration. For another example, this time with timing factored, former Army Special Operations Officer operator Dave Ryer managed to fire at 6 targets in 2.81 seconds with dual firing. However, despite both he and the targets being stationary, this resulted in just 2 solid hits, 1 mediocre glancing hit, and he missed 3 of the targets completely. In contrast, when he fired using only a single gun, while it did take almost a second more to fire at all 6 targets, 3.73 seconds in this case, all but one of the hits was right on target, and the one that wasn't was only barely off. While they concluded from all this dual firing was not effective, in fact, when he dual fired with both guns pointed at a single target, he was able to maintain his accuracy with both weapons, effectively allowing for a doubling of the rate of fire, should he so choose, while also doubling the number of bullets at his disposal without reloading or drawing another weapon. Further, even with his non-optimal technique in the video of more or less stabbing at the target with each shot rather than stabilizing both hands together in front with his only real movement being his trigger fingers, this at least pretty clearly demonstrated dual firing can be useful in some scenarios, similar to historic examples, just not necessarily when trying to fire at multiple targets simultaneously in most cases, with exceptions such as the aforementioned account from Wild Bill Hickok when his attackers were quite literally on top of him. When the attackers are that close, it's hard to miss, and aiming at 2 people at once can potentially be of benefit and indeed be practical. So this all brings us to the recommended way to dual fire to try and take advantage of the benefits the technique offers while minimizing the potential decrease in accuracy. Ryer aside, firearms experts we observed doing this almost universally recommend holding both weapons close together and in front, such that your hands are more or less pressed together for added stabilization and ensuring both guns are mostly locked on the same target. You then use one of the gun's sights for targeting and ignore the others. That said, there is a slightly more sophisticated way to do this recommended by the former Soviet counterintelligence agency called SMERSH, with the end goal here to add a tiny bit more stabilization. Founded in 1942 and disbanded in 1946, SMERSH's official duties, beyond making people chuckle over their name, which Stalin came up with as a portmanteau of 2 Russian words that more or less mean death to spies, involved routing out counter-revolutionaries and eventually attempting to capture Hitler. It is this group who originally found Hitler's body after Hitler bravely and with no regard for his own personal safety managed to infiltrate the Führer bunker and take himself out. Going back to firing 2 guns at once, SMERSH agents were trained to press their hands together out in front of them, as many other dual shooters recommend, but in addition, they would also wrap their thumbs around each other in a sort of looping X hook for added stability. Noteworthy here is that it's believed that a similar tactic was used by the Soviet NKVD, of whom SMERSH were an offshoot because their standard sidearm, the Nagant M1895, was a revolver that only held 7 rounds. Firing in this manner allowed them to fire 14 rounds with only a minor decrease in their overall accuracy, if any. Of course, in all of this, modern weapons with their extreme accuracy, reliability, and often high number of bullets they hold, combined with the absurdly rare cases where one would actually need to double the number of rounds in their hands at a given moment, makes it so seemingly no firearm expert today recommends anyone bother with practicing dual wielding. And certainly the way it's depicted in film, with the protagonists practically doing a gymnastics routine, sometimes even firing at targets on opposite sides of them simultaneously, is a surefire way for even the world's best shooters to hit absolutely nothing unless the targets are right next to them, or, the size of Mount Everest. On June 7, 1912, Lieutenant Roy Kirtland took off from a field outside College Park, Maryland, in a Wright Model B, the first aircraft ever purchased by the American Army Air Services. To his right sat Captain Charles Chandler, a Lewis light machine gun cradled between his legs. As Kirtland banked the aircraft 300 feet over the field, Chandler took aim at a white cloth banner staked out on the ground below and opened fire. It was the first time in history a machine gun had ever been fired from an aircraft, and it proved frighteningly effective, with a full 12% of the 47 rounds fired finding their target. And with that, the age of aerial warfare had begun, and the world, well, it would never be the same again. Yet, despite this promising start, when the Great War broke out in 1914, few armies knew quite what to do with their newfangled flying machines. At first, aircraft were mainly used for aerial reconnaissance and artillery spotting, serving alongside tethered observation balloons. But many pilots carried pistols and rifles in case they were shot down behind enemy lines, and inevitably they turned these weapons on each other, leading to the first aerial duels. On August 25, 1914, Frenchman Roland Garros became the first pilot
pilot to damage another aircraft in combat, wounding a German airman with his pistol, while on September the 7th, Russian pilot Pyotr Nesterov scored the first ever aerial victory by ramming his French Marine aircraft into an Austrian Albatros, his action leading to the deaths of both aircrew. As the Great War ground on and the strategic importance of air power grew, designers on both sides set about creating dedicated fighter aircraft with which to defend their airspace. But almost immediately, they ran into a major problem. By 1914, most aircraft were of tractor configuration, with the engine and propeller in front of the pilot, and attempting to fire a machine gun through the propeller arc was likely to end in said pilot having a very bad day. At first, the designers simply worked around the problem, building pusher-style aircraft with the propeller in the rear and the gunner in the front, such as the Vickers FB-5 gun bus, the first purpose-built fighter aircraft to enter service. But this solution proved awkward and unwieldy, pusher aircraft at the time being too slow and unmaneuverable to keep up with their targets. The very worst among these early fighters was the French Spad SA-1, which placed the engine and propeller in between the pilot and gunner, so that in the event of a crash landing, the unfortunate gunner would either be crushed or cut to pieces. Other aircraft, like the Bristol F-2 fighter, placed the gunner in the rear cockpit, firing a flexibly mounted machine gun at an angle, while still others, like the Avro 504, mounted guns atop the wing to clear the propeller arc. But none of these solutions were ideal for a variety of reasons, and the ultimate goal remained to mount an aircraft guns forward of the cockpit, where they could be aimed by pointing the entire aircraft and reached by the pilot for reloading or to clear jams. One early method of doing this was invented by none other than Roland Garros, who in December of 1914 had the propeller of his Marine Saulnier Type L monoplane fitted with metal wedges to deflect stray bullets. While crude, this installation proved surprisingly effective, with Garros scoring the first aerial victory using a machine gun fired through a propeller on the 1st of April 1915. Garros would also score 2 more victories with this aircraft before being forced down behind enemy lines on April the 18th. While he attempted to burn his aircraft before being captured, he was unsuccessful, and his deflector-equipped propeller fell intact into German hands. By this time, the Germans had already developed their own solution to the propeller problem, and it was about to turn the tide of the air war. In June 1915, a revolutionary new aircraft appeared in the skies over the Western Front, the nimble German Fokker E-1 Eindecker monoplane. Almost overnight, every other fighter aircraft became obsolete, and for nearly 6 months, the German Imperial Air Service enjoyed near total air superiority over Allied forces, a period that came to be known as the Fokker Scourge. Much of the Eindecker's effectiveness lay in its machine gun, which could fire safely and reliably through the propeller thanks to a clever device invented by a Dutch engineer, Anthony Fokker, the gun synchronizer. Gun synchronizers are sometimes erroneously referred to as interrupter gear, implying that the mechanism interrupts the firing of the guns whenever the propeller is in the way, but this is not the case. World War I machine guns, such as the German MG-08, had a firing rate of about 7 rounds per second, while aircraft propellers rotated around 20 revolutions per second, meaning that even a 2-bladed propeller would interrupt the gun up to 6 times per firing cycle, preventing it from ever firing. Instead, Fokker synchronizer used the rotation of the engine itself to fire the gun. In this system, a circular metal plate with 2 protruding cam lobes is fixed to the rear of the engine, the lobes being arranged at right angles to the propeller blades. To fire the guns, the pilot pulls a lever that lowers a cam follower onto the rotating plate. Whenever the propeller blades are horizontal and out of the way, one of the lobes strikes the follower, which in turn activates a mechanical linkage that fires the gun. Thus, the gun operates not as a true machine gun, but rather as a semi-automatic rifle whose trigger is pulled by the engine whenever the propeller is clear. But even with this system, variations in engine speed and ammunition quality can still cause the synchronization to drift, leading to the inevitable destruction of the propeller and the aforementioned bad day for the pilot. Synchronizer mechanisms thus had to be adjusted for each individual aircraft. This was done by fitting a wooden disc to the propeller hub and firing the guns through it. The pattern of bullet holes was then used to adjust the angle of the firing cams so that the pattern of shot fell safely between the propeller blades. While Fokker's original design gave the German fighter aircraft a huge advantage in the latter half of 1916, it was a limited design that could only be made to work with a single machine gun and proved fragile and difficult to maintain in combat.
Fokker thus designed an improved system which moved the firing cams to the guns themselves and transferred the engine's rotation to the cams using flexible drive shafts. As the firing cam on each gun could be adjusted individually, 2 or even 3 guns could now be mounted on the same aircraft. Introduced in the summer of 1917, the new system would remain the standard for the German Imperial Air Service until the end of the war. Following the appearance of the Fokker Eindecker in June 1915, the British scrambled to develop synchronizer gear of their own. Their first attempt, the Vickers Challenger gear, wasn't exactly the most elegant system, requiring the machine gun to be mounted to the left side of the engine. But sometimes good enough is, well, good enough, and the Vickers Challenger gear at least gave the Allies a fighting chance against the Fokker Scourge until April 1916, when the capture of a German synchronizer gear allowed the Sopwith Aircraft Company to reverse engineer their own version. But all these early British systems were rendered obsolete by the introduction of the CC synchronizer, named after its inventors, munitions officer Major Colley and Romanian inventor George Constantinescu. Based on Constantinescu's work on wave propagation through fluids, the CC synchronizer used hydraulic oil to transmit sound pulses from the engine to the guns. Not only was the system universally adaptable to any engine and aircraft type, it provided far more reliable and easy adjustment than all other systems, and starting in November 1917 became the standard for all British fighter aircraft. Though the Germans captured many examples of the CC gear, they were never able to reverse engineer it, as they erroneously assumed it to be a standard hydraulic system. But by this time, other factors like the British naval blockade of German shipping and the entry of America into the war had already turned the tide of the battle in the favor of the Allies, and German pilots were never again to enjoy the same air supremacy that they had in 1915. After the war, mechanical and hydraulic synchronizers were largely replaced by electric types, but by the 1930s, the use of synchronizers had largely fallen out of favor. The traditional fighter armament of 2 rifle-caliber machine guns mounted in the nose was becoming increasingly ineffective against the new generation of all-metal bomber aircraft, and aircraft designers started moving towards harder-hitting arrangements of larger-caliber guns mounted in the wings. However, several nations such as Germany, Italy, Japan, and the Soviet Union continued to use synchronized nose gun-mounted guns throughout the Second World War. Many of the war's top-scoring aces, like Germany's Erich Hartmann and Hans-Joachim Marseille, preferred nose guns, as they did not lose accuracy with range, unlike wing-mounted guns, which had to be harmonized to converge at a certain distance ahead of the aircraft. The last aircraft to use synchronizers were Soviet Lafokin LA-11s and Yakolev Yak-9s, flown by North Korean pilots during the 1950 to 1952 Korean War. By this time, propeller-powered fighters had finally given way to jets, eliminating the need for synchronization gear altogether. While the heyday of gun synchronizers was relatively brief, their impact on warfare is incalculable. Synchronizers were the key technology that turned the airplane from marginally useful curiosity into a deadly and indispensable weapon. And let's do some bonus facts. While popular culture has painted the life of a World War I pilot as dashing and romantic, the reality was far less glamorous. No surprises there. Aerodynamics was still poorly understood, and aircraft were designed largely based on guesswork and trial and error. Built of wood, canvas, and wires, they could be extremely fragile machines, sometimes breaking apart in mid-air when handled too roughly. Furthermore, unlike in modern radial engines where the cylinders are fixed and only the propeller spins, in World War I rotary engines, the whole massive engine block spun around its shaft, generating violent gyroscopic forces that pulled many an inattentive pilot into a deadly spin. Cockpits were open and unheated, exposing pilots to bitter sub-zero temperatures at altitude, and until the introduction of primitive oxygen equipment near the end of the war, altitude sickness and even the bends were regular hazards. Little wonder then that at the height of the Fokker Scourge, the average lifespan for a British pilot, most of whom had received less than 15 hours flight training, was a mere 11 days. Incredibly, despite all these risks, few World War I pilots carried parachutes, as doing so was seen as a sign of cowardice. Officers often banned the use of parachutes, as they believed this would encourage pilots to return their expensive aircraft intact, rather than just bailing out. And if all of this wasn't enough, aircraft rotary engines were lubricated with castor oil, which would often spray black into pilots' faces and into their mouths. Given the particular effects of castor oil on the human digestive tract, it's not hard to imagine what a pilot's
its first destination often was after reaching the ground. And now for another bonus fact. The death of German ace of aces Manfred von Richthofen, better known as the Red Baron, has traditionally been attributed to Canadian pilot Arthur Roy Brown, who claims to have shot down Richthofen's aircraft on April 21, 1918, over Monacourt Ridge near the River Somme. But subsequent investigations have cast serious doubt on this account. At the time of his death, Richthofen was in pursuit of another Canadian pilot, Wilfred Wop May. Seeing his comrade in trouble, Brown dove steeply and fired briefly at Richthofen's aircraft before pulling up to avoid hitting the ground. Richthofen then continued his pursuit of May for another 2 minutes before crash landing, mortally wounded, in a sector occupied by the Australian Imperial Force. When Richthofen's body was autopsied, it was found that he had been hit by a single .303 caliber bullet from below, which had entered his right armpit and exited just below his left nipple. Not only had Brown's attack come from above and to Richthofen's left, but such a wound would have caused Richthofen to bleed out rapidly, making it impossible for him to have continued pursuing Wop May as long as he did. So then the question is, well, who did kill the Red Baron? While sources vary, the most likely candidate is Sergeant Cedric Popkin, an anti-aircraft gunner of the Australian 24th Machine Gun Company, who claimed to have fired at Richthofen's aircraft twice during the final dogfight. Of these, Popkin's description of the second engagement appears to match the angle at which the fatal bullet struck Richthofen. Other proposed candidates include gunners W.J. Snowy Evans and Robert Bui of the 14th Australian Field Artillery Brigade, but these have since been dismissed since their reported angles of fire do not match Richthofen's wounds. Nonetheless, Arthur Brown was and still is officially credited with shooting down the Red Baron. Despite this claim to fame, however, Brown seldom spoke of the affair, stating, "There is no point in me commenting as the evidence is already out there." And now for another bonus fact. Do you like confined spaces, heights, and cold temperatures? Well then, you'd have been perfect for one of World War I aviation's most dangerous jobs, Zeppelin's spy car observer. By 1916, improved British air defenses had forced German Zeppelin bombers to operate at high altitudes out of reach of enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Unfortunately, this often placed them above cloud cover, making navigation and bomb aiming nearly impossible. To get around this, in 1916, Captain Ernst Lehmann and Baron Gemmingen, the nephew of airship designer Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, invented the observation car, or spy car, a torpedo-shaped vehicle that could be lowered on a cable from a Zeppelin through the clouds with one very unlucky crewman on board. Equipped with a compass, a map, and a telephone, the spy car observer would relay commands to the helmsman on navigation and when to drop the Zeppelin's bombs. Yet while observers experienced bitterly cold temperatures and the terrifying prospect of being cut loose in an emergency, Zeppelin crews eagerly volunteered for spy car duty, as it was the only place on the hydrogen-filled airship where they could smoke.
Throughout the history of modern warfare, the record for longest confirmed sniper kill is one that has steadily got more and more extreme as technology has progressed. At the time of recording this, the holder of that record is British sniper Craig Harrison, who notably broke the previous record twice on the same day by hitting 2 enemy targets on 2 consecutive shots, an astounding 2,474 meters away. That's 8,116.8 feet or 1.54 miles, or the length of about 22.5 NFL football fields. The shot was from such an extreme range that it took the bullet about 3 seconds to reach the target. Corporal of Horse Craig Harrison made his record-breaking shot in November of 2009 while stationed in the Helmand province of Afghanistan. Harrison personally didn't find out about its record-breaking nature until after he returned home in 2010. The distance from which he took the shot, which was measured and confirmed via GPS, amazed his superiors in the Ministry of Defence so much that they published the details of his shot almost as soon as he got back to the UK, and even granted permission to give interviews about it to the world's media. If you're wondering about the circumstances surrounding the shot, Harrison was providing cover fire for his commanding officer and members of the Afghan National Army who had been ambushed by 2 insurgents. According to Harrison, the insurgents were armed with a PKM machine gun and had pinned down the soldiers, giving him only a short time to assess the situation and subsequently line up a shot to ruin the attacker's day. With the help from a spotter, Cliff O'Farrell, and 9 test shots to nail down the exact distance, Harrison lined up his shot and squeezed squeezed the trigger for a 10th time, firing a .338 Lapua Magnum round and striking the machine gunner in the gut, killing him. The remaining insurgent, who wouldn't have even heard the shot coming, reached out to take command of the now free machine gun, only to be hit by a second round launched by Harrison. With both insurgents down, Harrison pulled the trigger one more time to disable the machine gun itself. Thus, Harrison not only broke the previous record, 7,972 feet, set in 2002 in Afghanistan, held by Canadian Rob Furlong using his Macmillan TAC-50, but he made the shot essentially 3 times in a row without missing, hitting 2 insurgents and their machine gun. This means he technically broke the record twice within a few seconds of one another. As if all of this wasn't impressive enough, the actual shots were noted as being about 3,000 feet beyond the L115A3 rifle's effective range. Needless to say, as Harrison said, conditions were perfect, no wind, mild weather, clear visibility. Interestingly, despite the interviews he gave over the matter, we shouldn't really know Harrison's real name. Official Ministry of Defense rules state that the identities of snipers, regardless of interviews of this nature, should never be disclosed publicly, as they would quickly become prime targets. Harrison was well aware of this rule and reportedly only agreed to speak with the media about his record shot on the understanding that his identity wouldn't be disclosed or that they'd give him a pseudonym. However, for reasons that are unclear, the Ministry of Defense never passed this restriction onto any of the media outlets Harrison spoke with, and they all released stories crediting Harrison under his real name, with some sources even noting where he lived. The police quickly warned Harrison and his family that they were in danger after the story was printed. To protect his wife, daughter, and himself, Harrison was left no choice but to uproot his family, which in turn resulted in his wife losing her job and his daughter being pulled out of school mid-year. We're also guessing that for the following few months, Harrison ensured that his wife and daughter were always within 8,000 feet of his location, just in case. Understandably, Harrison got pretty upset about his identity being printed in the news when he was explicitly told it wouldn't be. Thus, he asked the MOD for compensation for drawing a bullseye on his family's backs and to cover moving expenses. He was later awarded £100,000 for his trouble.